The stagecoach door swung open, and the crowd fell silent. Margaret Hale stepped down, silver hair beneath a worn bonnet, lines etched deep around eyes that had seen too much. 53 years old in a town that ordered brides like catalog goods, expecting youth and beauty. The whispers started immediately. Too old. A mistake. What was he thinking? Caleb Turner stood frozen on the platform, his letter crumpled in one hand, staring at the woman who wasn't supposed to exist. But Margaret didn't flinch. She'd survived worse than their judgment. What she carried in her past, though, that could destroy them all. Welcome to Black Hollow Ridge, where nothing is as it seems. If you're watching from somewhere in this world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're ready for a tale of courage, secrets, and second chances that will keep you listening for the next 2 hours, hit that like button and settle in. Because Margaret Hale's story, it's just beginning. The November wind cut through Black Hollow Ridge like a blade, carrying dust and the smell of coal smoke from the mines that scarred the Montana hillsides. The town crouched in a valley between steep ridges, a collection of weather-beaten buildings clinging to existence in country that didn't forgive weakness. Margaret Hale felt the cold through her threadbare coat as she stood on the platform, her single carpet bag at her feet. Around her, the crowd that had gathered to witness the arrival of Caleb Turner's mail-order bride began to disperse, their curiosity curdling into disappointment. "Well, I'll be damned," someone muttered. Turner's finally lost his mind. Margaret kept her eyes forward, her spine straight despite the 2-day journey that had left every muscle aching. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more cruelty. Better to stand tall and let them think what they would. Caleb Turner remained on the platform, a tall man in his early 40s with the build of someone who'd spent his life hauling freight and stocking shelves. His dark hair showed threads of gray at the temples, and his weathered face held the kind of exhaustion that came from raising 2 children alone while running a business that barely stayed afloat. He looked at Margaret. She looked back. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Mr. Turner," Margaret said finally, her voice low and steady. "I'm Margaret Hale. I believe you were expecting me." Caleb's jaw worked. He glanced at the letter in his hand, the response he'd received 3 months ago from the matrimonial agency in St. Louis. Refined widow, experienced in household management, seeking respectable situation. They hadn't mentioned her age. He'd assumed naturally that any woman desperate enough to travel west as a mail-order bride would be young. He cleared his throat. "Yes, I was. Expecting you. That is..." He stopped, visibly gathering himself. "Welcome to Black Hollow Ridge, Mrs. Hale." "Miss Hale," Margaret corrected quietly. "I never took my late husband's name in practice." More whispers rippled through the remaining onlookers. Even that small detail marked her as odd, as not quite right. In this country, women didn't keep their maiden names. They belonged to their husbands, their fathers, their sons. Caleb picked up her bag. "My wagon's this way." They walked through the dusty main street in silence. Margaret cataloged her surroundings with the careful attention that had kept her alive through harder years than these people could imagine. The town was small, maybe 300 souls, with the defeated look of a place that had never quite prospered. A general store dominated one corner, its sign reading Turner and Sons in faded paint. A saloon across the street, a church with peeling whitewash, a doctor's shingle hanging above a narrow doorway. And everywhere, the mines. The scaffolding visible on the hillsides, the ore carts on iron rails, the men with coal dust ground so deep into their skin it would never wash clean. "The mines are the life of this town," Caleb said, following her gaze. "Victor Harland owns most of them, owns most everything, truth be told." There was something careful in his voice, a warning wrapped in information. Margaret nodded but didn't reply. The wagon was a practical affair, hitched to 2 sturdy horses. Caleb helped her up to the bench seat with awkward courtesy, then climbed up beside her. As they started down the street, Margaret felt eyes tracking their progress from every window, every doorway. "My store's there," Caleb said, pointing to the building they were passing. "We live above it. 2 rooms for me and the children, 1 room that's been waiting." He paused. "I should tell you about the children." "Please do." "Sarah's 12. Thomas is 9. Their mother died 3 years back. Influenza. His hands tightened on the reins. They're good children. A bit wild, maybe. They've had no woman's hand to guide them. I see. I want to be clear, Miss Hale. Caleb's voice dropped lower. I need help. The store, the children, it's too much for one person. I need a wife who can manage a household, who can be a mother to 2 grieving children, who can help me keep this business from going under. He glanced at her. I expected someone younger, someone who might bear more children, build a proper family. And instead you got me, Margaret said evenly. I didn't mean. You meant exactly that, Mr. Turner, and it's the truth. I'm 53 years old. I've been worn down by hard years and harder luck. I can't give you more children. I can't give you the pretty young wife you imagined would step off that stage. She met his eyes. But I can give you honest work, a well-run household, and patience with your children. The question is whether that's enough. Caleb drove in silence for a long moment. Why did you come here? A woman with your experience, your education. I can hear it in how you speak. You don't belong in a place like this. Perhaps that's why I came, Margaret said. Because I don't belong anywhere else. They reached the store and Caleb pulled the horses to a halt. Before he could help her down, the door above burst open and 2 children tumbled out onto the exterior stairs. Sarah Turner was all angles and suspicion, her dark hair pulled back in a hasty braid, her dress too short at the ankles. She'd grown recently, Margaret noted, and no one had let out the hems. The girl's eyes were sharp as she studied the newcomer. Thomas was smaller, with his father's dark coloring but his mother's delicate features. He hung back behind his sister, peering around her shoulder. This is her? Sarah demanded. This is the new wife. Mind your tongue, Caleb said sharply. This is Miss Hale, and you'll show respect. She's old, Thomas whispered, not quietly enough. Sarah elbowed him, but didn't disagree. She descended the stairs slowly, circling Margaret like a wary animal. Papa said you were coming to be our new mother. I'm coming to marry your father, Margaret corrected gently. Being your mother is something that would have to be earned, Sarah, on both sides. The girl's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected that answer. I don't need a mother, she said, but her voice wavered. I take care of Thomas just fine. I cook and clean, and I'm sure you do, Margaret said, and that's far too much burden for a 12-year-old girl to carry, but we can discuss that later. For now, why don't you show me where I'll be staying? Sarah's jaw set. For a moment, Margaret thought the girl might refuse. Then she turned and marched back up the stairs. This way. The rooms above the store were cramped but clean, cleaner than Margaret had expected. Someone had made an effort, though the dust in the corners and the disorder of daily life couldn't be entirely hidden. 2 bedrooms opened off a small common room that served as kitchen and sitting area. A narrow door led to what must be the 3rd room Caleb had mentioned. Sarah pushed it open with more force than necessary. This was Mama's sewing room. Papa cleared it out for you. The space was tiny, barely large enough for the narrow bed and small dresser that furnished it. But the window faced east, and someone, Caleb, probably, had hung plain curtains and left a basin and pitcher on the dresser. It's perfect, Margaret said. It's small, Sarah countered. I've lived in smaller. The girl studied her with those sharp eyes. Where did you come from? Why did you answer Papa's advertisement? Sarah, Caleb began. It's all right, Margaret said. She set her carpet bag on the bed and turned to face the girl directly. I came from St. Louis most recently. Before that, other places. As for why I answered your father's advertisement, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I needed a new beginning, and your father needed help. Sometimes that's enough. Do you know how to cook? Thomas asked from the doorway. Yes. Good cooking? Not just beans and bacon? Despite everything, Margaret felt a small smile tug at her lips. Better than beans and bacon, I promise. Can you make pie? The boy pressed. Thomas, enough, Caleb said. Let Miss Hale settle in. We'll talk over supper. The children retreated reluctantly. Caleb lingered in the doorway, his hat in his hands. I know this isn't what either of us expected, he said quietly. But I'm a man of my word. If you're willing to try, so am I. We can be married tomorrow if you're agreeable. Pastor Jennings can do it quietly. No fuss. Tomorrow is fine, Margaret agreed. But I'd like to make one thing clear, Mr. Turner. I don't expect your affection. I don't expect to share your bed unless you wish it. What I do expect is respect and honest dealing. Can you give me that? Caleb met her eyes. Yes, ma'am, I believe I can. Then we have an understanding. After he left, Margaret sank onto the narrow bed and allowed herself one moment of weakness. Her hands trembled as she removed her bonnet. 3,000 miles she'd traveled to reach this remote corner of Montana. 3,000 miles to escape the life she'd left behind. The secrets that could still destroy her if the wrong person asked the right questions. But here, in this forgotten town at the edge of civilization, perhaps she could finally disappear. Perhaps she could finally be safe if they didn't look too closely, if they didn't ask too much, if the past stayed buried where she'd left it. The wedding took place the next morning in the sparse front room of the church, with Pastor Jennings officiating and his wife serving as witness. Sarah and Thomas attended, both dressed in their Sunday clothes, both wearing expressions of profound skepticism. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. Margaret repeated the vows in a steady voice, feeling the weight of previous promises, previous lives. Caleb's voice was gruff but clear. They exchanged no rings. He had none to give, and she wanted none to wear. I now pronounce you man and wife, Pastor Jennings intoned. He glanced at Caleb expectantly. Caleb cleared his throat and gave Margaret a brief, awkward kiss on the cheek. Congratulations, Mrs. Jennings said without much enthusiasm. Her eyes lingered on Margaret's face, cataloging every line, every year. I'm sure you'll make a fine addition to our community. Thank you, Margaret said. They walked back to the store through streets still quiet in the early morning. A few people paused to watch them pass, but no one offered congratulations. The news would spread quickly enough. Caleb Turner had married his mail-order bride despite her age, despite the whispers. The town would have opinions. Let them, Margaret thought. She'd survived worse than small-town gossip. The first days of marriage fell into a cautious rhythm. Margaret rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, real breakfast, not the hasty meals the children had grown accustomed to. Eggs and bacon, fresh biscuits, coffee, strong enough to chase away the mountain cold. She cleaned the neglected corners of the living quarters, mended the children's worn clothes, took inventory of the household supplies. Caleb watched her work with an expression somewhere between relief and bewilderment. You don't have to do all this at once, he said on the third morning, finding her scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees. It needs doing, Margaret replied simply. Yes, but... He paused. You're not a servant, Miss Hale. Mrs. Turner, I mean. Margaret is fine. She sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of silver hair from her face. And I know I'm not a servant, Mr. Turner, but I am a woman who pays her debts. You gave me a home and a name. This is how I can repay that. Caleb, he said. If you're Margaret, I'm Caleb. She nodded. Caleb, then. The children were harder to win over. Sarah maintained her wall of suspicion, watching Margaret's every move with critical eyes. She'd been running the household for 3 years, and she didn't appreciate an interloper taking over her responsibilities, even if those responsibilities had been crushing her. Thomas was more open, but still wary. He'd been 6 when his mother died, old enough to remember her, young enough to have the memories already fading. He tested Margaret constantly, pushing boundaries, seeing how far he could go before she reacted. Margaret met both approaches with patient consistency. She didn't try to replace their mother. She didn't demand affection. She simply showed up, day after day, doing the work that needed doing. On the 5th day, she ventured into town alone for the first time. The general store needed supplies, and Caleb was occupied with a freight delivery. Margaret took the list he'd written and walked down the dusty main street, feeling eyes tracking her from every window. The mercantile was run by a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Greenlee, who looked Margaret up and down with barely concealed disdain. Mrs. Turner, what can I do for you? Margaret handed over the list. These items, please. Mrs. Greenlee scanned the list, her lips pursing. Some of this is costly. Does Caleb know you're ordering such extravagances? My husband gave me this list himself, Margaret said evenly. I'm simply collecting what he requested. The woman began gathering items with deliberate slowness. You know, we were all quite surprised when Caleb went ahead with the wedding. Most men would have sent you right back where you came from. No offense meant, of course, but you're not exactly what anyone expected. No offense taken, Margaret said, though they both knew offense was precisely what had been intended. I just worry about those poor children, Mrs. Greenlee continued, warming to her subject. They need a proper mother, someone young and energetic who can keep up with them. Not, she gestured vaguely at Margaret. Not someone like me, Margaret finished. I understand your concern, Mrs. Greenlee, but the children and I will manage. Will you? The woman's eyes glittered. Do you even know how to handle children? At your age, I imagine yours are long grown, if you had any. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the warning that always preceded dangerous questions. I've had experience with children, she said carefully. What kind of experience? The kind that taught me patience and understanding. Margaret took the wrapped parcels Mrs. Greenlee had assembled and placed them in her basket. How much do I owe you? The transaction completed in chilly silence. As Margaret left the mercantile, she heard Mrs. Greenlee call out to someone entering behind her. You won't believe what I just heard. Margaret walked quickly back toward the store, her heart beating faster than the exertion warranted. This was the danger, the questions, the curiosity, the people who wouldn't leave well enough alone. In a small town, secrets were currency, and everyone wanted to be rich. She was halfway back when she heard the commotion from the direction of the mines. Shouting, running feet, the frantic clanging of an alarm bell. Men poured into the street from every building, pulling on coats, grabbing tools. Margaret stepped aside as they rushed past, their faces grim. Cave in, one man gasped as he ran by. Eastern shaft. They're saying half the day shift's trapped. Margaret's blood went cold. She turned and ran back toward the store, her parcels forgotten on the ground. Caleb was already outside, shouting orders to men gathering in the street. He saw Margaret and quickly crossed to her. Get inside, lock the doors, this could get ugly. How bad is it? Bad. 15, maybe 20 men trapped. If we don't get them out fast. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. All around them, the town was mobilizing. Wives and children appeared in doorways, their faces pale. The mine owner's carriage came rattling down the street, Victor Harlan himself visible through the window, his expression thunderous. Caleb, Margaret gripped his arm. The doctor. Does the town have medical supplies ready for something like this? Dr. Patterson keeps some things on hand, but Caleb's face darkened. Not enough. Never enough. Last time this happened, 5 years back, men died waiting for treatment. Margaret's mind raced. Where's the doctor's office? Margaret, no. I need you to stay with the children. The children are old enough to watch themselves for a few hours. Where's the doctor's office? Caleb stared at her. Down the street. The building with the green door. But what can you possibly... Margaret was already moving. Dr. Patterson's office was in chaos when she arrived. The doctor himself was a man in his 60s, thin and gray, frantically pulling supplies from cabinets with shaking hands. A younger man, his assistant perhaps, was doing the same. Dr. Patterson, Margaret said sharply. He spun around. Mrs. Turner? This isn't the time. How many injured are you expecting? At least 20, maybe more. But I don't have... He gestured helplessly at his meager supplies. I don't have enough of anything. Not enough bandages, not enough laudanum, not enough clean water. I don't even have enough space to treat them all. Margaret stepped into the room, her eyes cataloging what was available. Do you have scissors? What? Scissors. Sharp ones. And any clean fabric in this town. Sheets, tablecloths, anything that can be torn for bandages. Dr. Patterson blinked. Yes, but... Then send your assistant to collect every bit of clean fabric he can find. Tell the women to boil water, as much as they can. Large pots, clean containers. She turned to scan the office. You'll need more room. Is there a building nearby that could serve as a temporary hospital? The church hall. But I can't possibly manage that many patients alone. You won't be alone, Margaret said quietly. Tell me what else you need. The doctor stared at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face. Recognition of capability, of someone who knew what they were doing. Can you handle blood? Yes. Broken bones? Yes. Have you done this before? Margaret met his eyes. Yes. She didn't elaborate, She couldn't. But Dr. Patterson, faced with disaster and desperate for help, chose not to press. Get to the church hall. I'll have everything sent there. And Mrs. Turner? He paused. Thank you. Margaret ran. The church hall was a large open room with wooden benches and a cold fireplace. Margaret immediately began organizing, her movements swift and efficient. She'd done this before, though in places and circumstances she couldn't reveal. The muscle memory remained. How to arrange space for treatment, how to prioritize supplies, how to prepare for the worst. Women began arriving with armfuls of linens. Margaret set them to tearing bandages and boiling water. Some looked at her strangely, this newcomer, this unwanted bride, suddenly taking charge. But they were too frightened for their men to question. You there, Margaret pointed to a younger woman. I need tables, anything strong enough to lay a man on, and bring all the lamps and candles you can find. We'll need light. The woman nodded and ran. Within an hour, the hall was transformed. Tables lined the walls. Bandages lay stacked and ready. Boiling water steamed in large pots over fires hastily built in the yard outside. A separate area had been curtained off for the most serious cases. Then the first wounded arrived. They came on stretchers, on men's backs, stumbling under their own power with blood streaming down their faces. The air filled with groans and screams, the smell of blood and coal dust and fear. Dr. Patterson rushed in and stopped short, taking in what Margaret had accomplished. Dear God, he breathed, then louder. Bring the worst cases here. Mrs. Turner, can you handle the minor injuries? Yes. Margaret moved into the chaos with steady hands and a calm voice. A young miner with a gash across his forehead. She cleaned the wound, stitched it closed with practiced efficiency. An older man with a crushed hand. She splinted the fingers, gave him whiskey for the pain, moved on. Another with a deep laceration on his arm. Another with a broken collarbone. Hours blurred together. Margaret worked without stopping, her dress soon soaked with blood and dirt. Around her, other women helped as they could, but they looked to her for direction, for the calm certainty that kept panic at bay. This one's not breathing, someone screamed. Margaret was there in seconds. A young man, maybe 20, his lips blue, his chest still. She tilted his head back, cleared his mouth, bent and breathed air into his lungs. Once, twice, pressed on his chest, breathed again. The watching crowd held its breath. The young man gasped and coughed. Get him warm, Margaret ordered. Watch him closely. If he stops breathing again, call for me. She stood and moved to the next patient. Dr. Patterson worked on the worst cases, amputating a miner's crushed leg, trying desperately to save a man with internal bleeding who wouldn't survive the night. But for every patient he lost, Margaret saved 3. Her hands never trembled, her voice never wavered. Finally, as dawn light began filtering through the windows, the last patient was stabilized. The hall fell quiet except for the groans of the injured and the quiet weeping of the women who'd lost husbands, fathers, sons. Margaret stood in the center of it all, swaying with exhaustion, her hands stained dark with blood. Dr. Patterson approached her slowly. His face was gray with fatigue, but his eyes were sharp. Where did you learn to do this? He asked quietly. Does it matter? Margaret replied. It might. I learned where I learned. I did what needed to be done. That's all. That's not all. He lowered his voice. You've had medical training, real training, not just frontier midwifery or folk remedies. You knew what you were doing in there, the way you moved, the way you worked. He paused. Who are you, Mrs. Turner? Margaret felt the old fear rising. I'm a woman who helped save lives tonight, nothing more. I don't believe that. Then don't. Margaret pulled off her bloodied apron. But if you're wise, Dr. Patterson, you won't ask questions that might make me leave this town, because the next time disaster strikes, and in a mining town there's always a next time, you'll need me. She walked out into the cold morning air before he could respond. The town was stirring, people emerging from their homes to learn the extent of the damage. Margaret walked through the streets alone, her body aching, her mind numb with exhaustion. She'd revealed too much. She knew that. Dr. Patterson wasn't a fool, and now he'd seen what she was capable of. How long before he started asking questions? How long before others did the same? But what choice had she had? Let men die to protect her secrets? She couldn't do that. Whatever else she'd done, whatever she'd fled, she couldn't stand by and let people suffer when she had the skill to help, even if it destroyed her. Margaret reached the store as the sun was fully rising. She climbed the stairs slowly, every muscle protesting. The door opened before she could reach for it. Sarah stood in the doorway, still in her nightgown. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Papa said there was an accident. He said you went to help. Yes. Are you? The girl's voice cracked. Are you all right? Margaret looked down at herself, at the blood, the dirt, the ruin of her dress. I'm fine, just tired. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Patterson came by. She said you saved her husband's life. She said you saved lots of men's lives. She said... The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. She said you were amazing. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. She reached out slowly and touched Sarah's shoulder. The girl didn't pull away. I did what I could, Margaret said quietly. That's all. That's not all, Sarah said, echoing Dr. Patterson's words. That's not all at all. She stepped aside to let Margaret enter. Inside, Caleb sat at the table, his face haggard with worry and relief. Thomas was curled in his father's lap, half asleep. Caleb looked up as Margaret entered. I heard what you did. News travels fast. In a town this size, it was traveling before you even finished. He stood carefully, settling Thomas into a chair. Margaret, I don't understand. How did you know what to do? I had training a long time ago. What kind of training? Margaret met his eyes. The kind I don't talk about. Silence fell. Caleb studied her face, and Margaret could see him wrestling with himself, wanting to press, knowing he shouldn't, understanding that some secrets were too dangerous to uncover. Finally, he nodded. All right, I won't ask, but Margaret... He paused. Thank you for what you did, for those men, for this town. His voice roughened. For showing me I was wrong about you. Wrong how? I thought I was settling, taking what I could get because I was desperate, but I was the one who was gotten. This town got something it didn't deserve, something I definitely didn't deserve. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself in years. She blinked them back fiercely. You got a woman with secrets and a past she can't share. Be careful what you thank me for, Caleb Turner. I'll take my chances, he said quietly. Sarah moved closer, reaching out tentatively. Can I help you clean up? I can heat water for a bath. Margaret looked at the girl, this suspicious, guarded child who was offering kindness for the first time. I'd like that very much. As Sarah bustled to heat water as Caleb carried Thomas to bed, as the town outside began to fully wake and reckon with the night's disaster, Margaret sat at the table and allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe she'd found a place she could stay. But even as the thought formed, she knew better. The questions would come. The suspicions would grow. Someone would dig deeper, push harder, refuse to let it go. And when they did, when the truth finally came out about who she'd been and what she'd done, Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of old sins and older choices. She'd bought herself time with blood and skill and desperate necessity, but time always ran out eventually, and when it did, she'd lose everything all over again. The respect came slowly, like spring thaw in mountain country, grudging and incomplete, but undeniable. In the days following the mine collapse, Margaret found herself regarded differently on the streets of Black Hollow Ridge. Men tipped their hats who'd previously looked through her. Women who'd whispered behind their hands now nodded in greeting. Mrs. Patterson stopped her outside the mercantile to press her hands and murmur thanks through tears. But respect, Margaret had learned, was a double-edged blade. It brought attention. And attention brought questions. She was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the store when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. Heavy boots, measured pace, a man accustomed to being obeyed. Victor Harlan stood at the top of the steps, his broadcloth suit immaculate despite the dust that coated everything in this town. He was perhaps 60, with steel gray hair and the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile genuinely decades ago. Wealth and power had carved deep lines around his mouth. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding." Margaret set down the shirt she'd been pinning and wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Harland, what can I do for you?" "I came to express my gratitude. Personally." He descended the steps with the careful movements of a man whose joints had begun to stiffen. "You saved several of my men. Good workers. Hard to replace in country like this." Margaret noted how he valued them. As assets, as labor. Not as human beings with families who loved them. "I'm glad I could help." "Yes, about that." Harlan's eyes sharpened. "Dr. Patterson tells me you have considerable medical knowledge. Training, even. Quite unusual for a woman of your background." "I've picked up skills over the years," Margaret said carefully. "Picked up?" Harlan's smile didn't reach his eyes. The doctor was quite specific. He said you worked with the precision of someone formally educated, that you knew procedures even he had to learn from textbooks. He paused. "Where exactly did you acquire such education, Mrs. Turner?" Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest. "I worked alongside doctors in my younger years. I learned by observation." "Is that so? Which doctors? In which cities?" "Mr. Harland, I appreciate your interest, but my past is my own affair." "Normally I'd agree." He clasped his hands behind his back, a posture of false casualness. "But you see, Mrs. Turner, I have certain responsibilities to this town. I employ most of the men here. I own the land their homes sit on. When a stranger arrives, a stranger with mysterious skills and an unwillingness to discuss her history, well, I become concerned." "Concerned about what, precisely?" "About who you really are. About what you might be hiding." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I'm hiding nothing that threatens you or this town, Mr. Harland. I'm simply a woman seeking a quiet life." "Are you?" He stepped closer, and Margaret forced herself not to retreat. "Because in my experience, Mrs. Turner, people who seek quiet lives don't have the kind of skills you demonstrated. They don't handle emergency surgery with steady hands. They don't organize disaster response with military efficiency. They don't—" He paused. "They don't know things they shouldn't know." "I think it's time for you to leave," Margaret said quietly. "I'm sure you do." Harlan adjusted his cuffs. "But let me be clear, Mrs. Turner. I will find out who you are. I have resources you can't imagine. Contacts in every major city between here and the Atlantic. If you've left trouble behind you, if you're running from something or someone, I will discover it. And then what? That depends on what I find." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Turner. We'll speak again soon." Margaret watched him descend the stairs and disappear around the corner. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against her apron to still them. This was the nightmare she'd feared. A man with power and resources and the will to dig into places that should remain buried. If Harlan started asking the right questions in the right cities, if he made the right connections— "Margaret?" She spun to find Caleb standing in the doorway, a crate of goods balanced on his shoulder. His face was troubled. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough." He set the crate down heavily. "What does Harlan want with you?" "To know my business, to control me like he controls everything else in this town." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He saw what you can do, and now he wants to own it. That's how Victor operates. Everything's property to him. Everything has a price." He paused. "Margaret, are you in some kind of trouble? Real trouble?" Margaret considered her answer carefully. "I left behind a life that had no room for me anymore. What I did there, who I was, it's complicated. But I haven't broken any laws. I'm not running from justice." "But you are running." "Yes," she admitted. "I am." Caleb nodded slowly. "All right, that's enough for me. But Harlan won't let it go. Once he fixes on something, he's like a dog with a bone." "I know. So what do we do?" The question surprised her. "We." As if her problems were now his problems. As if marriage, even their strange practical arrangement, meant something more than a business transaction. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "I've never stayed anywhere long enough for someone like Harlan to catch up with me." "Well," Caleb picked up the crate again. "Maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to stay and face it." Before Margaret could respond, Sarah came running around the corner, her braid flying loose. Papa, Papa, come quick! Thomas is hurt! They found Thomas in the alley behind the store, curled on his side and clutching his arm. Blood seeped between his fingers. 3 older boys stood nearby, their faces flushed with a mix of guilt and defiance. Caleb was beside his son in an instant. What happened? They said she was a witch, Thomas gasped through tears. They said Margaret killed people and brought them back to life, and that made her a witch. I told them to shut up, and they... He winced as Caleb examined his arm. Gently, Margaret said, kneeling beside them. She carefully moved Thomas's hand away to reveal a deep gash running from elbow to wrist. Glass glittered in the wound. He fell on a broken bottle. We didn't mean for him to get hurt, one of the older boys said. He was perhaps 14, already broad-shouldered from mine work. We were just talking. He came at us. Defending my wife's honor, Caleb said coldly. Get out of here, all of you, and you can tell your parents to expect a visit from me. The boys fled. Caleb turned back to Thomas, his face pale. How bad is it? Bad enough to need stitches, but he'll be fine. Margaret helped Thomas to his feet. Let's get him upstairs. In the kitchen, Margaret cleaned the wound while Thomas bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. Sarah hovered nearby, her face pinched with worry. This will hurt, Margaret warned, threading the needle. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face, but his jaw set with determination. Margaret worked quickly and efficiently, her stitches small and neat. Sarah watched with wide eyes as the wound closed under her stepmother's hands. Where did you learn to do that? The girl asked quietly. A long time ago, in a place far from here. Were you a doctor? Margaret's hand stilled for just a moment. No, not a doctor. But you could have been, Sarah pressed. Couldn't you? Margaret tied off the last stitch and reached for a clean bandage. In a different world, perhaps, but not in this one. Why not? Because this world doesn't allow women to be doctors, Sarah. You know that. That's stupid. Yes, Margaret agreed. It is. Thomas had fallen into an exhausted sleep by the time Margaret finished bandaging his arm. Caleb carried him to bed, while Sarah lingered in the kitchen, watching Margaret clean blood from her hands. The boys were right, weren't they? The girl said suddenly. You did bring men back to life. I heard people talking about it. They said there was a miner who'd stopped breathing, and you made him breathe again. I helped him breathe. There's a difference. Is there? Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. Can you teach me how to do what you do? Margaret looked at the girl, this fierce, intelligent child who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Why would you want to learn? Because, Sarah's voice cracked, because when Mama was dying, I couldn't do anything. I just watched her get weaker and weaker, and there was nothing I could do. I don't ever want to feel that helpless again. Margaret set down the cloth and turned to face Sarah fully. Medicine isn't about power, Sarah. It's about knowledge and skill, and accepting that sometimes, no matter what you do, it won't be enough. You can't save everyone. But you can try, can't you? You can at least try. Yes, Margaret said softly. You can try. Then teach me, please. Margaret studied the girl's face, seeing the desperate need for purpose, for control in a world that had taken so much from her. She recognized it because she'd felt it herself once, a lifetime ago. It's not an easy path, she warned, and people will judge you for it. They'll say women have no business learning such things. They'll call you unnatural, unwomanly. Let them, Sarah said fiercely. I don't care what they say. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, some barrier she'd built around herself beginning to crack. All right, I'll teach you what I can. But Sarah, she paused, this stays between us. Your father might not approve, and there are people in this town who would use it against us. People like Mr. Harland? Especially like Mr. Harland. Sarah nodded solemnly. I can keep a secret. The lessons began the next day in the quiet hours before dawn, when the town still slept and no curious eyes could watch. Margaret taught Sarah how to clean and dress wounds, how to recognize the signs of infection, how to set a simple fracture. The girl learned with fierce concentration, her hands steady and her questions sharp. But while Sarah bloomed under Margaret's instruction, The town's attention continued to grow. Dr. Patterson began referring patients to her. Women with difficult pregnancies, children with mysterious ailments, injuries beyond his aging skills to treat. Margaret tried to refuse, but word spread anyway. The strange older bride who'd saved lives during the mine disaster had healing knowledge the town desperately needed. It was Mrs. Greenlee who brought the moral outrage to a head. Margaret was in the mercantile, purchasing supplies, when the woman's voice cut through the general conversation like a blade. It's unnatural, that's what it is. A woman practicing medicine without any proper authority. For all we know, she could be making people worse. Margaret continued examining a bolt of fabric, pretending not to hear. I heard she's been teaching that stepdaughter of hers, another woman added, teaching a child to handle blood and disease. What kind of woman does such things? The kind who has something to hide, Mrs. Greenlee said significantly. Mark my words, there's something wrong about Margaret Turner. Always has been. A woman her age, arriving alone with all these mysterious skills, she's hiding something dark. I can feel it. Margaret set down the fabric and turned to face them. The conversation died abruptly. You're quite right, Mrs. Greenlee, Margaret said quietly. I am hiding something. Would you like to know what it is? The women stared at her, caught between curiosity and alarm. I'm hiding the fact that I care more about saving lives than about your approval. I'm hiding the fact that I think women are capable of far more than this town gives them credit for. And I'm hiding the fact that I find your gossip petty and your judgment tiresome. She picked up her parcels. Good day, ladies. The silence followed her out of the store and down the street. Margaret's heart hammered, adrenaline flooding her system. She'd been too bold, too confrontational. In the past, she would have deflected, apologized, made herself smaller. But something had changed. Perhaps it was Thomas defending her honor. Perhaps it was Sarah's fierce desire to learn. Perhaps it was simply that she was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting fear dictate every choice. Whatever the reason, Margaret Turner had just declared war on the moral authority of Black Hollow Ridge's respectable women, and they would not forgive it. The retaliation came swiftly. Within days, the whisper campaign intensified. Margaret was a fraud, a charlatan, possibly dangerous, certainly improper. The wives of prominent citizens, including Mrs. Harland herself, made it clear that Margaret was not welcome in polite society. Dr. Patterson came to see her one evening, his face troubled. I've been asked to stop referring patients to you, he said without preamble. Several of the town's leading citizens feel it's inappropriate. They've suggested that if I can't handle the medical needs of this community alone, they'll bring in another doctor. And you need their support, Margaret said. I need their money, he corrected grimly. This town can barely afford one doctor, let alone two. If they withdraw their patronage, he spread his hands helplessly. I'm sorry, Margaret. You're more skilled than I am in many ways, but I can't risk my practice. I understand. After he left, Margaret stood at the window, looking out at the darkening street. She'd known this would happen. She'd pushed too hard, revealed too much. Now the consequences were arriving, as they always did. But this time, she had something she'd never had before. She had Caleb, who believed in her despite the secrets. She had Sarah, who looked at her with a mix of admiration and hope. She had Thomas, who'd fought other boys to defend her name. She had, for the first time in decades, something worth fighting for. The crisis came 3 weeks later, on a cold November evening when the first snow had begun to dust the mountain peaks. Margaret was preparing supper when she heard the frantic pounding on the door. She opened it to find a young woman, barely 20, her face contorted with pain and fear. Please, the woman gasped. Please, you have to help me. The baby's coming wrong and Dr. Patterson is drunk. I went to his office and he could barely stand. Please, Mrs. Turner, you're the only one who can help. Margaret recognized her, Emma Reeves, wife of one of the miners. 7 months pregnant, maybe 8. Far too early for a safe delivery. Come inside, Margaret said, already moving into action. Sarah, I need you. The girl appeared instantly, her face alert. Boil water. Gather all the clean linens we have. Wake your father and tell him to fetch Dr. Patterson. I don't care how drunk he is, we need him sober. Margaret turned back to Emma. How long have you been having pains? Since this morning, but they got bad about an hour ago, and there's blood. Emma's face crumpled. I'm going to lose the baby, aren't I? Not if I can help it, Margaret said firmly. But I need you to be brave. Can you do that? Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. Margaret helped her onto the table. There was no time to move her anywhere else. As she examined the young woman, her worst fears were confirmed. The baby was breech, and Emma was hemorrhaging. Without immediate intervention, both mother and child would die. Sarah returned with supplies, her eyes wide but her hands steady. Papa's gone for the doctor. What do you need me to do? Hold her hand. Talk to her. Keep her calm. Margaret scrubbed her hands viciously in the boiling water, her mind racing through the procedures she'd performed before, in another life, under another name. This was the moment, the choice that could save 2 lives or destroy her own. If she did nothing, if she waited for Dr. Patterson to arrive in whatever condition he might be in, Emma and her baby would almost certainly die. But if she acted, if she demonstrated the full extent of her surgical skill, the questions would become impossible to deflect. Margaret looked at Emma's terrified face, at Sarah standing ready to help, at the life hanging in the balance. The choice had already been made. Sarah, she said calmly, I'm going to talk you through something. I need you to listen carefully and do exactly as I say. What followed was hours of intense, desperate work. Margaret's hands moved with the precision of long practice, guiding Sarah through steps the girl should never have known, performing procedures that would have shocked anyone watching. Emma screamed and wept and begged for it to be over, but Margaret's voice remained steady, guiding her through each contraction, each impossible moment. When Dr. Patterson finally arrived, pale and shaking and reeking of whiskey, the crisis had passed. Emma lay exhausted but alive on the table, her newborn son crying lustily in Sarah's arms. Patterson stared at the scene, his mouth open. How did you... The baby was breech, Margaret said quietly, washing blood from her hands. I had to turn him. The hemorrhaging was severe, but I managed to stop it. You turned a breech baby? Manually? Patterson's voice rose. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? How much skill it requires? I've only seen it done once by the most experienced surgeon in Boston, and even he stopped abruptly, his face going pale. Boston. The surgical theater at Massachusetts General. There was a woman there years ago, an assistant to the chief surgeon. They said she had hands like... He stared at Margaret with dawning recognition. It's you. You're her. Margaret felt the world tilting beneath her feet. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Patterson moved closer, his voice dropping. Margaret. What was the name? Margaret Ashford. The Ashford scandal. They said she was the most talented surgical assistant ever trained, that she could have been a great surgeon if she'd been born male. But then there was that incident with the senator's son, and she disappeared. His eyes widened. What did you do, Margaret? What made you run? Before Margaret could answer, the door burst open. Victor Harlan stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with cold, calculating eyes. Behind him stood Mrs. Greenlee and several other prominent women of the town. We heard screaming, Harlan said. We came to investigate. And what do we find? Margaret Turner performing surgery, illegal surgery, on a young woman without any authority whatsoever. His smile was thin and triumphant. I believe this constitutes practicing medicine without a license, a criminal offense in the territory of Montana. Margaret straightened slowly, still holding the bloodied cloth. I saved a woman's life, and her child's life. If that's a crime, then arrest me. Oh, I intend to, Harlan said. But first, I think we all deserve to know the truth. Dr. Patterson seems to have recognized you. Perhaps he'd like to share what he knows. Patterson looked between Harlan and Margaret, conflict clear on his face. Tell them, Margaret said quietly. There's no point in hiding it now. Her name is Margaret Ashford, Patterson said reluctantly. She worked at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston 15 years ago. She was trained by Dr. William Ashford himself, one of the finest surgeons in America. Margaret was his assistant, his protégé. Some said she was more skilled than he was. He paused. But she was a woman, and women aren't allowed to practice medicine. The medical establishment tolerated her only because Dr. Ashford protected her. Until I operated on a patient without his supervision, Margaret finished. A senator's son bleeding to death from a riding accident. Dr. Ashford was in surgery with another patient. I knew if I waited, the boy would die. So I operated. I saved his life. Her voice hardened. And for that crime, I was denounced, threatened with prosecution, run out of Boston in disgrace. Dr. Ashford died shortly after. They said the scandal broke his heart, and I've been running ever since. The room fell silent. Emma Reeves stared at Margaret with a mix of awe and fear. Sarah stood frozen, her newborn charge still cradled in her arms. So you see, Harlan said with satisfaction, our mysterious Mrs. Turner is a fraud and a criminal, a woman who performed illegal medical procedures in Boston and has been doing the same here. I think the territorial marshal will be very interested in this information. You can't arrest her, Emma said suddenly, her voice weak but fierce. She saved my life. She saved my baby. Look at him. She gestured at the squalling infant. Would you rather he was dead? Would you rather I was dead? The law is the law, Harlan said. Personal gratitude doesn't change that. Then your law is broken, Caleb said from the doorway. No one had noticed him return, but now he stepped into the room, his face set with determination. If the law says a woman can't save lives, if it says she has to stand by and watch people die just because she was born female, then the law is wrong, and I won't let you use it to destroy my wife. Your wife is a criminal, Harlan said. My wife is a healer, the best this town has ever seen, and if you try to take her away, if you try to punish her for saving lives, then you'll answer to me, and to every person in this town whose life she's saved. Caleb's voice rose. How many of your miners did she save during the collapse, Harlan? How many men who work your shafts and make your profits are alive today because of her? Harlan's jaw tightened. That doesn't excuse... It excuses everything, Caleb interrupted. In my book, at least, and I'm not the only one who will see it that way. A commotion outside the door grew louder. Voices, many of them, raised in anger and concern. The crowd that had gathered when word spread of Emma's crisis had grown, and now they pushed into the room, miners still black with coal dust, their wives, their children, people Margaret had treated, people she'd saved. What's this about arresting Mrs. Turner? One of the miners demanded. She's practiced medicine illegally, Harlan said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. She's a fraud. She's no fraud, another man interrupted. She saved my arm when Dr. Patterson wanted to amputate it. Look, he held up his hand, flexing the fingers. Good as new. She delivered my baby when I was bleeding to death, a woman called out. The doctor was drunk and useless, but Mrs. Turner stayed with me all night. She taught me how to care for my sick mother, another voice added. She never asked for payment, never turned anyone away. The voices rose, overlapping, a chorus of gratitude and defense. Harlan's face darkened with anger as he realized he was losing control of the situation. This is mob rule, he said sharply. The law can go to hell, someone shouted. The crowd roared approval. Margaret stood at the center of it all, stunned by the outpouring of support. These people, these suspicious, judgmental people who'd whispered about her age and her strangeness, were now defending her, fighting for her. Sarah moved to stand beside Margaret, still holding Emma's baby. They can't take you away, the girl said fiercely. I won't let them. Harlan's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. This isn't over, he said quietly to Margaret. I will find a way to expose you, to destroy you. You've humiliated me in front of these people, and that's something I don't forgive. I didn't humiliate you, Margaret said wearily. You did that yourself. Harlan turned and pushed through the crowd, his face rigid with fury. The women who'd accompanied him followed uncertainly, Mrs. Greenlee casting backward glances at Margaret with an expression somewhere between resentment and grudging respect. When they were gone, the crowd slowly dispersed, people touching Margaret's arm in passing, murmuring thanks and promises of support. Dr. Patterson lingered, helping to make Emma comfortable. You should have told me, he said quietly. All this time, I've been referring difficult cases to someone who trained under William Ashford himself. I've been acting like I was doing you a favor. You were keeping me safe, Margaret replied, or trying to. I appreciate that. What will you do now? Harlan won't stop. He has resources, connections. If he contacts the authorities in Boston, if he brings formal charges, then I'll face them. Margaret looked at Caleb, at Sarah, at the people still gathered in the street outside. I'm tired of running, Doctor. For the first time in 15 years, I have something worth staying for. So let Harlan do his worst. I'm not leaving. Patterson nodded slowly. Then you'll have my support, for whatever it's worth. After everyone had finally left, after Emma and her baby had been settled comfortably in the spare room to recover, after the blood had been cleaned and the supplies put away, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and allowed the exhaustion to overtake her. Caleb sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. Sarah had gone to bed, but Margaret knew the girl wasn't sleeping. She'd seen too much tonight, learned too much. Margaret Ashford, Caleb said quietly. That's your real name? It was. A long time ago. Why didn't you tell me? Because telling meant reliving it, explaining it, justifying choices I'm still not sure were right. Margaret rubbed her eyes. I thought I could leave it all behind, become someone new, but the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it? You saved that senator's son, Caleb said. That's what you said. You saved his life. Yes. Then why did they punish you for it? Because I was a woman doing a man's work. Because I challenged the natural order. Because I made powerful men feel threatened. Margaret's voice hardened. The senator was grateful his son lived, but he couldn't be seen endorsing a female surgeon. The medical establishment couldn't allow my success to stand. It would open doors they wanted kept locked, so they destroyed me instead. That's not justice. No, but it's the world we live in. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. What happened to Dr. Ashford? You said he died. Margaret felt the old grief rising. William Ashford was my mentor, my teacher, my protector. He believed women could be just as skilled as men in medicine, more skilled sometimes. He trained me in secret, taught me everything he knew, and when they came for me, he tried to defend me. But the strain of it, she swallowed hard. His heart gave out 3 months after I left Boston. I heard about it in a newspaper in a town whose name I don't even remember. I couldn't even attend his funeral. I'm sorry, Caleb said quietly. So am I. Every day. They sat in silence, the weight of revelation settling between them. Finally, Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. Thank you for telling me, he said. And thank you for staying, for fighting, for not running this time. Margaret looked at their joined hands, his calloused and strong, hers stained with blood that hadn't quite washed away. I'm not sure I had a choice. Not anymore. There's always a choice, Caleb said. You chose us. This family. This town. That means something. Does it? Margaret asked. Even knowing what I am, what I've done? Especially knowing what you are. Caleb's grip tightened. You're the woman who saves lives, who teaches my daughter to be brave and strong, who makes my son want to defend your honor, who makes me believe in second chances. He paused. That's who you are, Margaret. Not the scandal, not the past, just who you choose to be now. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks, the second time she'd cried in Black Hollow Ridge, both times because of this unexpected family she'd found. I don't deserve this. Maybe not, Caleb said gently. But you're getting it anyway. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall in earnest, blanketing the harsh landscape in forgiving white. And inside the small rooms above the general store, Margaret Ashford Turner allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that she might finally have found a place to call home. But in the finest house on the hill, Victor Harlan sat at his desk, composing a telegram to Boston. The hunt wasn't over. It had barely begun. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same young courier who brought all of Victor Harlan's correspondence. Margaret watched from the window of the store as the boy climbed the steps to the big house on the hill, his breath misting in the cold December air. She didn't need to see the contents to know what it contained. Harlan had been waiting for this, and so had she. The waiting was its own kind of torture. 3 weeks had passed since the night Emma Reeves gave birth. 3 weeks during which Margaret continued her work, treating the sick and injured who came to her door despite Harlan's disapproval. 3 weeks during which the town slowly chose sides, those who valued her skills and those who feared the consequences of supporting someone who'd defied both law and propriety. Sarah had thrown herself into learning with even greater intensity, as if knowledge could be armor against whatever storm was coming. The girl had natural talent, steady hands, and a quick mind that grasped concepts Margaret sometimes had to explain only once. In another world, Sarah Turner could have been a brilliant physician. In this world, she would likely end up married to a miner, her gifts wasted on endless childbearing and household drudgery. Unless Margaret could change that, unless she could fight hard enough to create a different kind of future, not just for herself, but for this fierce young girl who looked at her with such desperate hope. "You're wool gathering again," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her at the window. "That's the third time this morning I've caught you staring at nothing." "I'm staring at something," Margaret replied. "I'm staring at the moment everything changes." Caleb followed her gaze to Harlan's house. "The telegram." "Yes. What do you think it says?" "I think it says exactly what Victor wants it to say. That I'm a dangerous fraud, that I should be arrested, prosecuted, removed from decent society." Margaret turned from the window. "The question is what I do about it." "We do about it," Caleb corrected. "You're not alone in this, Margaret." She smiled despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "No, I suppose I'm not." The summons came that afternoon, not from the territorial marshal, as Margaret had half expected, but from Victor Harland himself. A written invitation, delivered by his house servant, requesting Margaret's presence at his home that evening to discuss a matter of mutual concern. "Don't go," Sarah said fiercely when Margaret showed her the note. "It's a trap. He'll have the marshal waiting, or worse." "If he wanted me arrested, he wouldn't bother with invitations," Margaret replied. She was putting up her hair, her movements calm and deliberate despite the trembling in her fingers. "Victor Harland is many things, but he's not impulsive. Whatever he wants, it's more complicated than simple prosecution." "Then I'm coming with you," Caleb said. "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "This is between Victor and me. Whatever game he's playing, I need to understand the rules before I involve anyone else." "Margaret, please, Caleb, trust me on this." He wanted to argue. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. But finally, he nodded. "If you're not back in 2 hours, I'm coming after you." "Fair enough." Margaret walked through the darkening streets alone, her best dress doing little to ward off the December cold. Snow crunched under her boots, lamplight spilled from windows where families gathered for their evening meals, warm and safe and oblivious to the battle being waged in their midst. Harlan's house dominated the top of the hill like a fortress, 3 stories of imported lumber and Eastern craftsmanship that announced its owner's wealth to anyone with eyes to see. Margaret had never been inside, had never expected to be invited. As she climbed the steps to the broad front porch, she felt the weight of scrutiny from the town below. Everyone would know she'd come here. Everyone would speculate about what it meant. The door opened before she could knock. A stern-faced woman in a housekeeper's uniform stepped aside to let her enter. "Mr. Harland is waiting in the study. This way." The interior of the house was as ostentatious as Margaret had imagined. Thick carpets, heavy furniture, oil paintings in gilt frames. Everything carefully chosen to project power and permanence. They passed through a parlor where a fire crackled in a marble fireplace, then down a hallway lined with bookcases. The study was a masculine room, all dark wood and leather, dominated by an enormous desk covered with papers and ledgers. Victor Harland stood at the window, his back to the door, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Mrs. Turner," he said without turning, "thank you for coming." "Did I have a choice?" "There's always a choice." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Please sit." Margaret remained standing. "I prefer not to." "Suit yourself." Harland moved to his desk and picked up a telegram. "I received this today, from a colleague in Boston. Would you like to know what it says?" "I can imagine." "Can you?" He read from the paper. "Margaret Ashford, former surgical assistant to Dr. William Ashford at Massachusetts General Hospital. Exceptional skill but unauthorized practice. Operated on Senator Harrison's son without supervision in 1868. Subsequent scandal led to her dismissal and Dr. Ashford's death from heart failure. Wanted for questioning regarding illegal medical practice. Last known location, St. Louis, 1875. Harland set down the telegram. "That's quite a history, Mrs. Turner. Or should I say, Miss Ashford?" "I've done nothing illegal in this territory," Margaret said evenly. "Whatever happened in Boston has no bearing on On the contrary, it has every bearing. Harlan circled around the desk, moving closer. You see, the medical board in Massachusetts is very interested in your whereabouts. They've been looking for you for years. Something about testimony you could provide regarding Dr. Ashford's conduct. Apparently there were questions about his methods, his disregard for proper authority. Your testimony could clear his name or condemn it further. Margaret's stomach clenched. William Ashford was a brilliant surgeon and a good man. Whatever they're trying to pin on him now that he's dead is immaterial to me, Harlan interrupted. I don't care about Boston politics or dead doctors. What I care about is this town, my town, and what happens to it. Your town, Margaret repeated. Is that how you see it, as your personal property? I own most of it, so yes. Harlan's smile was thin. The mines, the land, half the businesses. I employ 3/4 of the men here. Their livelihoods depend on my goodwill. Their family's survival depends on decisions I make every day. He paused. So when someone comes into my town and disrupts the natural order, when they challenge my authority and turn my workers against me, I take notice. I haven't turned anyone against you. Haven't you? The miners used to fear me. Now they stand in the street defending you, telling me my law is broken. His voice hardened. You've given them ideas, Mrs. Turner. Dangerous ideas about questioning authority, about women exceeding their proper place. That kind of thinking spreads like disease. Maybe it should spread, Margaret said quietly. Maybe people should question why laws protect power instead of people. Why women can't use their skills to save lives. Why a man like you gets to decide who deserves dignity and who doesn't. Harlan's eyes glittered. Careful, Mrs. Turner. You're on very thin ice. I've been on thin ice my entire adult life. I'm used to it. Are you? He returned to his desk and pulled out another document. This is a warrant for your arrest, signed by the territorial judge. All I have to do is present evidence of your illegal medical practice, and you'll be taken into custody. You'll be returned to Boston to face charges there. And this time, there'll be no Dr. Ashford to protect you. Margaret felt her pulse hammering in her throat, but she kept her voice steady. Then why haven't you done it already? Why this performance? Because I'm a businessman, Mrs. Turner, and I believe in negotiation. Harlan set down the warrant. I don't actually want you arrested. What I want is order, respect. The town functioning as it should, with everyone in their proper place. And where is my proper place? In your estimation? That depends on you. He leaned against the desk, studying her. You have skills this town needs. I won't deny that. Dr. Patterson is old and often drunk. The nearest other doctor is 2 days' ride away. People will continue to get hurt and sick, and they'll need someone competent to treat them. Someone like you. Margaret waited, sensing the trap closing. So here's my proposal, Harlan continued. You continue your medical work, but under my authority. You treat the people I tell you to treat when I tell you to treat them. You accept supervision from Dr. Patterson, public supervision, to maintain the appearance of propriety. And most importantly, you stop teaching that stepdaughter of yours. Stop giving her ideas about becoming something she can never be. No, Margaret said immediately. You haven't heard the full offer. I don't need to. The answer is no. Harlan's jaw tightened. You're refusing my protection? My offer to legitimize your work here? I'm refusing to be your puppet, to let you control who I help and how I help them. To sacrifice Sarah's future for your idea of order. Margaret met his eyes. You can take your warrant and your supervision and your proper places, Mr. Harland, and you can choose your next words very carefully, Harland warned. Face the consequences of trying to control what you can't own. Margaret's voice hardened. You don't own me. You don't own my skills. And you don't own the gratitude of the people I've saved. So go ahead. Send your warrant. Call the marshal. Drag me back to Boston. But know this. Every person in this town who's alive because of me will know why I'm gone. They'll know you chose your pride over their lives. And they'll remember. Harlan's face darkened with fury. You're making a grave mistake. I've made worse. Margaret turned toward the door. We're done here. Margaret, his voice stopped her at the threshold. She turned back to find him holding a photograph, an old daguerreotype in a tarnished frame. Do you know what this is? Margaret's blood ran cold. The photograph showed a younger version of herself standing beside William Ashford in what was clearly a hospital setting. She wore a surgical assistant's apron, and her face held the confident certainty of someone who'd found her calling. "Where did you get that?" "I have resources you can't imagine. Contacts in every major city, access to records you thought were buried." Harlan set down the photograph. "I know everything about you, Margaret Ashford. I know about the senator's son. I know about the other operations you performed in secret. I know about the women's clinic you helped run after you left Boston, the one that provided care to prostitutes and factory workers and other undesirables. I know about the abortion that went wrong in Philadelphia, the woman who died under your care." Margaret felt the room spinning. "That woman came to me already dying. I tried to save her, but you failed. And her death was ruled suspicious. There were questions, investigations. That's why you fled Philadelphia. That's why you kept running." Harlan's voice was almost gentle now, which made it more terrifying. "You see, Margaret, I don't just have the power to send you back to Boston. I have the power to destroy you completely. To make sure you never practice medicine again, never help anyone again. To see you hanged for murder if I choose to push hard enough." Margaret's legs threatened to give way, but she forced herself to remain standing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand what you're refusing. I'm offering you a chance to continue your work, to keep helping people, to stay with your new family. All you have to do is accept my terms. Accept that in this town, I make the rules." He paused. "Or you can refuse, and I'll ensure that every shameful secret, every failure, every death you've ever been connected to becomes public knowledge. I'll destroy not just you, but anyone who supported you, including Caleb Turner and his children." "You'd punish them for my choices?" "I'd punish them for defying my authority, for standing with you against me." Harlan's smile was cold. "So think carefully, Margaret. Is your pride worth their ruin?" Margaret stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything except submit to this man's control. But the faces of Caleb, Sarah, and Thomas rose in her mind. The life they'd built together, fragile and new. The future Sarah dreamed of, the healing she'd begun to do. All of it hanging by a thread that Victor Harlan held in his hands. "I need time to think," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow evening. Come back with your answer then." Harlan returned to the window, dismissing her. "And Margaret, choose wisely. Some cages are more comfortable than others, but make no mistake. You'll be in a cage either way. At least in mine, you'll still be useful." Margaret walked out of that house into the freezing night, her mind reeling. The streets were dark now, most families already settled in for the evening. She walked blindly, not heading home, but needing to move, to think, to find some way out of the trap that had closed around her. She found herself at the church, its white steeple stark against the starlit sky. The door was unlocked, it always was, and Margaret slipped inside, seeking not faith, but simply silence. A place to think without eyes watching, without questions demanding answers. The interior was dark, except for moonlight filtering through the plain glass windows. Margaret sank into a rear pew, her hands clasped in her lap, her mind racing through impossible options. If she accepted Harlan's terms, she'd become his instrument. He'd control who she treated, when, and how. He'd stop her from teaching Sarah, from giving the girl the knowledge that could set her free. And worst of all, she'd be proving that power always won, that people like Victor Harlan could always force compliance from people like her. But if she refused, he'd destroy her. More than that, he'd destroy Caleb and the children. They'd lose the store, their reputation, everything they'd built. And Margaret would likely hang for a death in Philadelphia that hadn't been murder but desperation, a woman bleeding out from a botched abortion she'd sought from some butcher, coming to Margaret too late, dying despite everything Margaret had tried. There was no good choice, only degrees of surrender. "I thought I might find you here." Margaret looked up to find Dr. Patterson standing in the aisle, his medical bag in his hand. He looked older in the dim light, his face lined with exhaustion. "I heard you went to see Harlan," he continued, sliding into the pew beside her. "The whole town's heard by now." "What did he want?" "To own me. To control what I do and who I help and how I do it." Margaret's voice was hollow. "And if I refuse, he'll destroy me. He has enough evidence of past mistakes to see me hanged." Patterson was quiet for a long moment. "The woman in Philadelphia, he said finally. "I heard rumors about that, but I also heard you tried to save her, that she was already dying when she came to you." "She was, but the law doesn't care about context. It only cares that she died under my care, and that the procedure was illegal." Margaret looked at her hands, still seeing the blood that had soaked them that terrible night. "I should have turned her away. I knew it was dangerous, knew she was too far gone, but she begged me, and I couldn't—" Her voice broke. "I couldn't just let her die without trying." "Of course you couldn't, because you're a healer. It's not something you can turn off." Patterson sighed heavily. "Victor Harland is a cancer in this town. He owns so much, controls so much, that even good men find themselves bowing to his will. I've done it myself more times than I care to admit. So what do I do? I don't know. But I do know that if you submit to him, if you let him dictate how you practice medicine, it'll kill something in you. Maybe not right away, but slowly. And the world needs healers with souls intact, Margaret. We're too rare as it is." Before Margaret could respond, the church door banged open. Sarah burst in, her coat half buttoned, her breath coming in gasps. "Margaret, you have to come quick. There's something wrong at the mines. Men are getting sick, really sick. They're saying it's spreading." Margaret was on her feet instantly. "What kind of sick? What symptoms?" "Fever, vomiting, some of them can't even stand. It started this afternoon with just a few men, but now there's dozens. The mine foreman sent for Dr. Patterson, but—" Sarah looked at the elderly doctor uncertainly. "But I'm old, and you need someone faster," Patterson finished without rancor. "Go, Margaret. I'll gather supplies and follow as quickly as I can." Margaret and Sarah ran through the dark streets toward the mine entrance. Already they could hear the commotion. Men shouting, women crying, the chaos of sudden crisis. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as people rushed toward the growing crowd. The scene at the mine was pandemonium. Men lay sprawled on the ground, groaning and retching. Others leaned against the buildings, their faces gray with pain and fear. The smell hit Margaret immediately, sharp, chemical, wrong. "Poison," she said immediately. "This isn't disease. They've been poisoned." The mine foreman, a burly man named Hendricks, pushed through the crowd. "Poisoned? How? We haven't eaten anything unusual, haven't—" "The water," Margaret interrupted. "When did you last check the water barrels?" Hendricks' face went pale. "This morning. We filled them from the creek like always." "Show me." He led her to a row of barrels set up near the mine entrance. Margaret dipped a tin cup into one and sniffed cautiously. The smell was faint but unmistakable, bitter almonds underlaid with something metallic. She didn't need to taste it to know. "Arsenic," she said. "Someone's poisoned the water supply." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Who would do such a thing? How? Why? But Margaret's mind was already racing ahead to more immediate concerns. Arsenic poisoning. Depending on the dose and how long ago they'd ingested it, some of these men could be saved. Others were likely already beyond help. "I need activated charcoal," she told Sarah, "as much as we can find. And milk, fresh milk, as much as the town can provide. We need to bind the poison before it's fully absorbed." Sarah nodded and ran off to organize the women. Margaret moved among the sick men, quickly assessing who was worst off, who might still be saved. Dr. Patterson arrived with his medical bag, and together they began the desperate work of treatment. It was like the mine collapse all over again, chaos and pain and the race against time. But this was different, more insidious. This wasn't an accident of nature or the hazards of mining. Someone had deliberately poisoned these men. As Margaret worked through the night, forcing charcoal and milk down throats, making men vomit to expel what poison remained, one thought kept circling through her mind. The timing of this was too perfect. Just hours after Harland had threatened her, just as she was weighing her choices, suddenly a crisis that demanded her skills. Coincidence? Or something more calculated? By dawn, the worst of the crisis had passed. 3 men had died despite everything Margaret and Dr. Patterson could do. They'd drunk too much of the poisoned water, ingested a fatal dose before anyone realized what was happening. Another dozen were gravely ill but stable. The rest would recover. Margaret sat on the steps of the mine office, too exhausted to stand, her dress ruined with vomit and worse. Sarah sat beside her, equally filthy, equally drained. "Who would do this?" the girl asked quietly. Who would poison the miners? I don't know, Margaret said, but she had suspicions. Dark, terrible suspicions. The mine foreman approached, his face haggard. Mrs. Turner, we've found something you should see. He led her to the creek where the water barrels had been filled. In the early morning light, she could see white powder residue on the rocks near the water's edge, carelessly spilled, partially washed away, but still visible. Someone dumped poison directly into the creek, Hendricks said. Sometime yesterday afternoon, we think. The morning crew drank from the barrels filled the night before and were fine. It was only the afternoon shift that got sick. Have you told Mr. Harland? He's on his way now. Someone sent word to his house. As if summoned by his name, Victor Harland's carriage came rattling up the road. He stepped out, taking in the scene with a calculating gaze. His eyes found Margaret, held for a long moment, then moved on. What's happened here? He demanded. Hendricks explained about the poisoned water, the deaths, the evidence by the creek. Harland's face darkened with what looked like genuine anger. This is sabotage, he said. An attack on my property, my workers. I want the marshal brought in immediately. I want this investigated. It's already being investigated, a new voice said. Margaret turned to see the territorial marshal stepping forward from the crowd, a weathered man in his 50s with a badge on his chest and a rifle in his hands. Marshal Cobb had been in town for 2 days, she'd heard, dealing with some minor claim dispute. His timing, like the poisoning itself, seemed too convenient. I've already examined the scene, Cobb continued, and I've got some questions, starting with you, Mrs. Turner. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Me? You were the first one to identify the poison. You knew immediately it was arsenic. That's pretty specific knowledge for a shopkeeper's wife. His eyes narrowed. Makes a person wonder how you knew. Makes a person wonder if maybe you had prior knowledge of what was in that water. That's ridiculous, Sarah burst out. Margaret saved these men's lives. Or maybe she poisoned them in the first place, Cobb said. Set up a situation where she could look like a hero. Wouldn't be the first time someone's done such a thing. The crowd murmured, uncertainty spreading. Margaret saw the doubt creeping into faces that had defended her just hours ago. She saw how easy it would be to believe the mysterious woman with the secret past, the outsider with strange knowledge, suddenly the savior in a crisis too perfectly timed. Marshal Cobb, Victor Harland's voice cut through the noise. I appreciate your thoroughness, but you're barking up the wrong tree. Mrs. Turner may be many things, but she's not a poisoner. Everyone stared at Harland in shock, Margaret most of all. With respect, Mr. Harland, the evidence, Cobb began. The evidence shows that someone poisoned my water supply. But it wasn't Margaret Turner. Harland's voice was firm. She's been under my eye for weeks now. I know where she was yesterday afternoon. She was at my home, at my invitation, discussing matters of mutual interest. She couldn't have been at the creek poisoning the water. It was a lie. Margaret had been at his home in the evening, not the afternoon, but Harland was providing her with an alibi, publicly vouching for her innocence. Why? Then who did poison the water? The marshal demanded. I suspect union agitators, Harland said smoothly. There have been whispers of men wanting to organize, wanting to demand higher wages and safer conditions. This seems like exactly the kind of terror tactic they'd employ. Poison a few workers, blame management, turn the men against me. It was masterful, Margaret realized. In one stroke, Harland had deflected suspicion from her, created a new enemy to focus the town's anger on, and justified whatever crackdown on worker organizing he'd been planning anyway. I want this town locked down, Harland continued. No one comes or goes without being searched. Any man suspected of union sympathy is to be questioned. And Marshal, I want you to work with Mrs. Turner on this. She knows poisons clearly. She might be able to help you identify who had access to arsenic, who would know how to use it. The trap had sprung. Margaret saw it clearly now. Harland had needed her complicit, needed her bound to him. The poisoning, whether he'd orchestrated it himself or simply seized the opportunity, had given him the perfect leverage. Now she'd have to work under his direction, proving her loyalty, or face renewed suspicion. And she'd have to do it all while 3 men lay dead, poisoned by water they'd drunk in the course of an honest day's work. Marshal Cobb looked between Harland and Margaret, clearly unhappy but unable to argue with his primary employer in the territory. Fine. Mrs. Turner, I'll need a statement from you about your knowledge of poisons, and a list of anyone in town who might have access to arsenic." "Of course," Margaret said quietly. As the marshal moved away to examine the creek again, Harland approached Margaret. He stood close enough that only she could hear his words. "3 choices, Margaret," he said softly. "Accept my terms, and we work together. Refuse and face the consequences. Or," he paused, "try to fight me and watch everything burn, including innocent people, like those 3 dead miners, like anyone else who gets caught in the crossfire." "You did this?" Margaret breathed. "You poisoned your own workers." "I did nothing of the sort, but I'm also not blind to opportunities when they present themselves." His smile was cold. "You have until this evening, as we agreed, but I think your answer just became much clearer, didn't it?" He walked away, leaving Margaret standing among the sick and the dying, the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders. Sarah took her hand. "What did he say to you?" Margaret looked at the girl, this brave, brilliant child who deserved so much more than the world was willing to give her. "He said I have a choice to make, between surrender and destruction." "Then we fight," Sarah said fiercely. "We fight him together." "Sarah, no. I heard what he's doing. He's trying to control you, to own you. But he can't. Not if we stand together. Not if the whole town stands together." "The town is terrified. 3 men are dead. They'll believe whatever Harland tells them to believe. Then we tell them the truth. We show them what he really is." Margaret wanted to believe it was possible, but she'd lived too long, seen too much, lost too many battles against men like Victor Harland. Power protected power. Money bought loyalty, fear silenced dissent, and she was just one woman with too many secrets and too much blood on her hands. But as she looked at Sarah's determined face, at the miners who'd survived because of her care, at the town that had defended her despite their prejudices, Margaret felt something shift inside her. A stubborn, reckless refusal to surrender without a fight. Maybe she couldn't win. Maybe Harland would destroy her anyway, but if she was going down, she'd go down fighting. Not for herself. She'd lost that battle years ago in Boston. But for Sarah, for all the women who came after, who deserved the chance to use their minds and their skills without men like Victor Harland deciding their worth. "All right," Margaret said quietly. "We fight. But Sarah, you need to understand, this could cost us everything." "I know," the girl said, "but some things are worth the cost." Margaret pulled Sarah into an embrace, holding tight to this child who'd become her daughter in every way that mattered. And as the sun rose over Black Hollow Ridge, painting the poisoned creek in shades of blood and gold, Margaret Ashford Turner made her choice. She would not surrender. She would not run. She would stand and fight, whatever the cost. And if the world wanted to crush her for it, let them try. The first person to fall sick was a child. Little Emma Hendricks, the mine foreman's daughter, woke that morning with a fever that sent her mother into immediate panic. By noon, 2 more children had taken ill. By evening, the number had climbed to 7, and the pattern was unmistakable. Whatever was spreading through Black Hollow Ridge, it was moving fast. Margaret stood in the church hall, transformed once again into a makeshift hospital, and felt dread settling into her bones like winter cold. She recognized these symptoms: the high fever, the characteristic rash beginning to bloom across small chests and backs, the dry cough that would soon turn wet and dangerous, scarlet fever. And in a mining town with poor sanitation and overcrowded housing, it would spread like wildfire. Dr. Patterson confirmed her diagnosis with a grim nod. "We need to quarantine the sick immediately, keep them isolated from the healthy population." "The families won't like it," Margaret said, asking mothers to leave their children. "They won't have a choice if they want those children to survive." Patterson's voice was harsh with exhaustion. He'd barely slept since the poisoning incident 3 days ago, and now this. "We need to set up strict protocols. No one in or out of the sick ward except trained caregivers. Everyone else stays away." "That leaves you and me," Margaret said. "Sarah can help, but she's still learning. We can't possibly manage." "Then we'll have to." Patterson gripped her arm. "Margaret, if this spreads unchecked, we could lose half the children in this town, maybe more. We have to contain it." They worked through that first night setting up the quarantine. The church hall was divided by sheets hung from ropes, one section for the sick, one for observation of those who'd been exposed, one small area for Margaret and Patterson to rest between shifts. Sarah moved between the sections with quiet efficiency, learning to recognize the progression of symptoms, to comfort frightened children, to keep meticulous records of who was sick and when they'd fallen ill. By the second day, 15 children were in the sick ward. By the third day, 23. And the first death came on the fourth morning. Little Jacob Peterson, only 5 years old, his small body unable to fight the infection despite everything Margaret tried. She stood over his shrouded form, her hands shaking with rage and grief. This was what Harlan's games had cost them. While she'd been forced to deal with the poisoning investigation, while resources and attention had been diverted to his manufactured crisis, the real threat had been building. If she'd noticed the first cases sooner, if she'd had time to prepare properly, maybe Jacob would still be alive. "It's not your fault," Caleb said quietly. He'd come to the church hall despite her orders to stay away, unwilling to leave her alone with her grief. "Isn't it? If I'd been paying attention instead of playing Harlan's games, you'd still be one person trying to hold back a tide." Caleb pulled her into his arms, and Margaret allowed herself a moment of weakness, leaning into his strength. "You can't save everyone, Margaret. You can only do your best. My best wasn't good enough for Jacob." "No, but it might be enough for the other 22 children in that ward, and for their parents, that's everything." Margaret pulled away, wiping her eyes roughly. "I need to get back to work." "You need to rest. You've been awake for 3 days straight. So has Patterson. So has Sarah. We can't afford to rest, not when—" A commotion at the church hall entrance interrupted her. Margaret turned to see Marshal Cobb pushing through the door, his face set in hard lines. "Mrs. Turner, I need to speak with you." "Not now, Marshal. I have patients who need— This can't wait." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "There's been another incident, more illness at the mines, but this time it's not children. It's the men who survived the poisoning. They're relapsing, getting sicker, and people are saying—" He paused. "They're saying maybe you didn't cure them properly the first time. Maybe you made it worse." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "That's impossible. Arsenic poisoning doesn't relapse like that. If they're getting sick again, it's something else entirely." "Maybe so. But Victor Harlan's been talking to people, raising questions about your methods, about whether you really know what you're doing, or if you're just—" Cobb's expression was uncomfortable. "He's saying maybe you're experimenting on people, using them as practice because you can't get proper medical work anywhere else." "That's a lie," Caleb said sharply. "Margaret's saved more lives in this town than—" "I know what she's done," Cobb interrupted. "But Harlan's got people scared, and scared people don't think straight. There's talk of removing you from the sick ward, Mrs. Turner, of bringing in a real doctor from Helena to take over." "That would take days," Margaret said. "By the time a doctor arrives from Helena, half these children could be dead. We need to act now." "I understand that, but I also can't ignore what's happening at the mines. I need you to come with me and examine these men, figure out what's wrong with them before this gets worse." Margaret looked back at the sick ward, at Sarah moving among the small patients with careful competence, at Dr. Patterson mixing medicines with trembling hands. They needed her here. But if the miners were truly sick again, if this was something beyond arsenic poisoning, she needed to understand what was happening. "Give me 10 minutes, she said finally. "I need to make sure Sarah knows what to do while I'm gone." The scene at the mines was chaos. Men lay groaning in the bunkhouse, their faces twisted with pain. But as Margaret examined them, confusion replaced her initial concern. These weren't symptoms of arsenic poisoning relapsing. These were symptoms of something else entirely. Food poisoning. Severe, but not life-threatening. Probably from spoiled meat, ghee, or contaminated water. "This isn't related to the arsenic," she told Marshal Cobb. "This is simple food poisoning. Unpleasant, but it'll pass on its own in a day or two. Keep them hydrated, let them rest. That's all they need." "You're sure?" "Completely sure." Margaret's mind was racing. 2 separate outbreaks, both creating panic, both perfectly timed to undermine confidence in her abilities. The pattern was too clear to ignore. "Marshal, who's been spreading the rumor that these men were relapsing? Who told you it was related to the poisoning?" Cobb's face darkened. "It was Harlan himself who sent word. Said his workers were dying, and it was your fault." "They're not dying. They're barely even sick. This is... Margaret stopped herself before she said too much. Accusing Victor Harland of deliberately creating panic would require proof she didn't have. This is a misunderstanding. Tell Mr. Harland his men will be fine. She returned to the church hall to find the situation deteriorating. 2 more children had died while she was gone. Sisters, both under the age of 8. Their mother sat in the corner, keening with grief so raw it cut through the air like broken glass. Dr. Patterson met Margaret at the door, his face gray. I couldn't save them. I tried everything, but they were too weak, too young. The fever took them so fast. It's not your fault, Margaret said, echoing Caleb's words to her. But the weight of those deaths settled on her shoulders nonetheless. 3 children dead, 3 families destroyed, and more would follow if they couldn't contain this outbreak. Sarah appeared beside them, her face streaked with tears but her voice steady. We're running low on willow bark for the fever, and we need more clean linens. Some of the mothers are asking to see their children, and I don't know what to tell them. Tell them no, Margaret said firmly. No one enters the sick ward except us. I don't care how much they beg or cry. We cannot risk spreading this further. They're saying we're being cruel, that we're keeping them from their babies. We're keeping their babies alive. Margaret's voice was harder than she intended. Sometimes that requires being cruel. The days blurred together after that. Margaret, Patterson, and Sarah worked in shifts, snatching a few hours of sleep when they could, forcing themselves to eat even when exhaustion killed their appetites. The death toll climbed. 5 children, then 7, then 9. Each loss carved a deeper wound in Margaret's heart. And through it all, Victor Harland's campaign of whispers continued. Questions about Margaret's qualifications. Suggestions that her methods were questionable. Reminders that she'd been run out of Boston, that she had secrets she wouldn't explain. The town began to fracture. Some families pulled their sick children from the church hall, preferring to care for them at home rather than trust the strange older woman with the mysterious past. Others defended Margaret fiercely, pointing to the children she'd saved, the lives she'd fought for. But fear was a powerful weapon, and Harland wielded it expertly. On the 8th day of the outbreak, Margaret was changing the bandages on a young boy when she heard raised voices outside the church hall. She looked up to see a group of townspeople gathering, their faces angry and frightened. Mrs. Greenlee stood at the front of the crowd. We demand answers, Mrs. Turner. Our children are dying under your care, and we have a right to know why. Margaret stepped outside, aware of how she must look. Haggard and filthy. Her dress stained with blood, and worse, her hair coming loose from its pins. I'm doing everything I can to save them. Are you? Or are you using our children for your experiments? Mrs. Greenlee's voice rose. You're not a real doctor. You have no license, no authority. For all we know, you're making them sicker. That's not true, Sarah said, pushing through to stand beside Margaret. You didn't see her these past 8 days. You haven't watched her fight for every child, stay awake for days, give everything she has. You're a child yourself, Mrs. Greenlee snapped. What do you know? She's been teaching you her witchcraft, filling your head with improper ideas. It's not witchcraft. It's medicine. Sarah's voice cracked with fury and exhaustion. And if more of you had let her teach you, if more of you had learned instead of judging, maybe we'd have more help in there. Maybe fewer children would have died. The crowd murmured, some in agreement, some in anger. Margaret put a hand on Sarah's shoulder, feeling the girl trembling with emotion. Your daughter has a sharp tongue, Turner, Mrs. Greenlee said to Caleb, who'd appeared in the doorway. You should control her better. My daughter speaks the truth, Caleb said quietly, and I'm proud of her for it. Of course you are. You're as bewitched as she is. Mrs. Greenlee turned back to the crowd. I say we remove Margaret Turner from the sick ward. We send for a proper doctor from Helena. We stop trusting our children's lives to a woman with a shameful past and questionable skills. And how many more children die while we wait for that doctor to arrive? Dr. Patterson demanded, emerging from the church hall. How many, Mrs. Greenlee? Can you tell me that? Better they die honestly than be poisoned by that woman's experiments. Experiments? Patterson's voice shook with rage. I've been a physician for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone work with more skill or dedication than Margaret Turner. She's saved twice as many children as I have. She's worked miracles in that ward while you've been out here spreading poison of a different kind. How dare you? How dare you, Patterson shouted. You sit in comfort while she works herself to death trying to save your children, and you have the gall to question her? She's worth 10 of you, Mrs. Greenlee. 10 of all of us. The crowd shifted, uncertainty replacing some of the anger. But before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Enough! Victor Harland walked up the church steps with measured calm, his presence immediately commanding attention. This arguing helps no one, least of all the sick children inside. Mr. Harland, Mrs. Greenlee said. You've been saying yourself that, Mrs. Turner's methods are questionable. I've been raising legitimate concerns about accountability and oversight, Harland corrected smoothly, which is very different from accusing her of poisoning children. Let's not lose sight of reason here. Margaret watched him carefully, trying to understand his angle. This was the man who'd been undermining her for weeks, and now he was defending her? The truth is, Harland continued, we're facing a crisis that requires all of us to work together. Mrs. Turner has skills we need, whatever questions we might have about her past. Dr. Patterson vouches for her abilities, and the children in that ward need care, not politics. He turned to Margaret. I propose a compromise. You continue your work, Mrs. Turner, but under direct supervision. I'll bring in a qualified physician from Helena to oversee your treatments to ensure everything is being done properly. That way the children get the best care possible, and the town can feel confident in the methods being used. It was a masterful move. On the surface, it seemed reasonable, even generous. But Margaret saw the trap clearly. A physician from Helena, chosen by Harland, would be under his control. They'd second-guess her decisions, slow down her work, gradually take over until she was rendered irrelevant. And if anything went wrong, she'd be the one blamed while Harland's doctor claimed credit for any successes. No, Margaret said. Harland's eyebrows rose. No? I won't work under those conditions. These children don't have time for oversight and committees. They need immediate care, decisive action. If you bring in another doctor, fine. But they work with me, not over me. Or I walk away, and you can explain to these families why their children are dying while doctors argue about proper procedures. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Caleb moved to Margaret's side, and Sarah gripped her hand. You're being unreasonable, Harland said, his voice cooling. I'm offering you a way to continue your work with legitimacy. You're offering me a cage with prettier bars, Margaret interrupted. And I'm done with cages, Mr. Harland. Done with compromises that protect powerful men while children die. So here's my counteroffer. Let me do my job without interference, or find someone else to do it. But understand this. I'm the best chance these children have, and everyone here knows it, even if they won't admit it. Silence fell. Margaret could feel the weight of every eye on her, judging, measuring, deciding. Then Emma Reeves stepped forward from the crowd, the young mother whose baby Margaret had saved weeks ago. I trust her, she said quietly. She saved my son's life. She's earned my trust. And mine, said another voice. One of the miners Margaret had treated after the collapse. Mine too, said a third. A woman whose difficult pregnancy Margaret had managed. One by one, people stepped forward. Not everyone. Fear still held many in its grip, but enough. Enough to make it clear that Margaret had support, that the town was divided, that forcing her out would cause its own kind of crisis. Harland's face remained impassive, but Margaret saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his options, deciding whether to push harder or retreat and regroup. Finally, he nodded. Very well. Continue your work, Mrs. Turner, but know this. If one more child dies unnecessarily, if there's any evidence of negligence or incompetence, I will personally ensure you face justice. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, Margaret said. The crowd dispersed slowly, still muttering among themselves. Margaret stood on the church steps, swaying with exhaustion and the adrenaline crash following the confrontation. That was either very brave or very stupid, Caleb said quietly. Probably both, Margaret admitted. But I'm tired of being controlled, tired of letting fear make my decisions. You've made an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory. I made that enemy the day I arrived in Black Hollow Ridge. At least now we're being honest about it. They went back inside to find Dr. Patterson organizing medicines with shaking hands. The old doctor looked up as they entered, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion. That was quite a speech, he said. Might have signed your death warrant, but it was quite a speech. How are the patients? Margaret asked, pushing personal concerns aside. Holding steady. Young Timothy's fever broke an hour ago. I think he's turned a corner, but little Mary is getting worse. I don't think she'll last the night. His voice cracked. I've given her everything I know, but it's not enough. Margaret moved to Mary's bedside. The girl was perhaps 6 years old, her small face flushed with fever, her breathing labored. Margaret had seen this pattern before, the fever that wouldn't break, the lungs filling with fluid, the slow descent toward death. But she'd also seen children survive against worse odds. If she could just keep Mary alive long enough for her body to fight back, if she could support her through the crisis. Sarah, she called, I need you to prepare a steam tent. We're going to help her breathe. They worked through the night, Margaret and Sarah taking turns holding the girl, keeping her upright, making her breathe the medicated steam. Dr. Patterson dozed fitfully in a chair, too exhausted to help but unwilling to leave. Somewhere around 3 a.m, as Margaret held Mary's small body against her chest, the girl stirred and whispered, Mama? Your mama's waiting for you, Margaret murmured. But you need to get better first. Can you do that for her? Can you fight? Mary didn't answer, but her breathing seemed to ease slightly. Margaret held her tighter, willing her own strength into the child's fragile body. Dawn came slowly, painting the church windows in shades of gray and gold, and as the first light touched Mary's face, her eyes fluttered open, truly open, clear and aware. I'm thirsty, the girl whispered. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Sarah, bring water, slowly now. Mary drank a few careful sips, then fell back into real sleep. Not the fevered unconsciousness she'd been trapped in, but genuine rest. Her forehead was cooler to the touch. The crisis had passed. Dr. Patterson woke to find Margaret crying silently, still holding the sleeping child. Is she? She's going to live, Margaret said. She's going to live. Patterson's face crumpled with relief. Thank heaven. After last night, I didn't think... I was so sure we'd lose her. We almost did. But she's stronger than she looks. They all are. If we just give them the chance to fight. Over the next 3 days, the outbreak began to wane. No new cases appeared. The children in the sick ward slowly improved, their fevers breaking, their strength returning. Not all survived. 11 children in total died before the disease ran its course, but 27 lived who might have died without treatment. 27 children who would grow up, marry, have families of their own. 27 futures saved by a woman the town had once called too old, too strange, too unwanted. The families came to collect their recovered children with tears and gratitude. Some pressed coins into Margaret's hands despite her protests. Others simply held their children tight and whispered thanks. Even Mrs. Greenlee, whose grandson had been among the survivors, approached Margaret with stiff formality. I may have spoken hastily, she said, in fear. My grandson is alive because of you. I acknowledge that. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but coming from Mrs. Greenlee, it was as close as Margaret would ever get. As the last family left the church hall, Margaret stood in the empty space and felt the exhaustion finally overtake her. She'd been running on nothing but will and coffee for nearly 2 weeks. Now, with the crisis past, her body demanded payment. She swayed and Caleb caught her before she fell. That's enough, he said firmly. You're going home. You're going to eat a proper meal, take a bath, and sleep for 24 hours straight. Doctor's orders. I'm the doctor, Margaret protested weakly. Fine. Wife's orders then. And before you argue, remember that I'm bigger than you and perfectly willing to carry you home like a sack of flour if necessary. Despite everything, Margaret laughed. That would be quite a sight. Wouldn't it? So let's spare the town the spectacle and have you walk on your own power. They walked home through streets that felt different somehow. People nodded to Margaret as she passed. Men tipped their hats. Women offered genuine smiles instead of suspicious glances. The town hadn't fully accepted her, probably never would, but something had shifted. She'd proven herself in fire, and that earned a certain grudging respect. But as they climbed the stairs to the rooms above the store, Margaret saw a sealed envelope tucked under the door. Her name written in elegant script she recognized immediately. Victor Harlan's handwriting. Caleb saw it too. Ignore it. Whatever he wants can wait. But Margaret picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and read the brief message inside. Her face went pale. "What is it?" Caleb demanded. "An invitation. To dinner at his home tomorrow evening." Margaret's voice was hollow. "He says we have unfinished business to discuss. He says it's time to settle our accounts." "You don't have to go." "Yes, I do. Because if I don't—" She looked at Caleb, at Sarah standing in the doorway, at Thomas sleeping peacefully in his bed. "He'll come for all of us. And this time he won't settle for threats." The storm was coming. Margaret had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And Victor Harland was done playing games. Margaret stood before the mirror in her small room, fastening the buttons of her best dress with fingers that trembled despite her best efforts to still them. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb pacing in the common room, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, for the third time in an hour. "Yes, I do." Margaret turned from the mirror. "Whatever Victor wants to say to me, whatever ultimatum he's prepared, it needs to be between us. If you're there, he'll use you as leverage. He'll threaten you to control me. He'll do that anyway. I know. But at least this way I'll hear his terms clearly, know exactly what I'm dealing with." She crossed to where Caleb stood and placed her palm against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her hand. "Trust me. I've survived worse than Victor Harland." "Have you?" Caleb's eyes searched her face. "Because from where I'm standing, he holds all the power. The money, the connections, the legal authority. What do you have to fight him with?" "The truth. And the people of this town who know what I've done for them." Margaret's voice hardened. "That may not be enough, but it's what I have. And I'm done being afraid of men who think power makes them untouchable." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face set with the same determination Margaret recognized in herself. "If you're going to fight him, you need to know something first." "Sarah, not now." "Yes, now." The girl stepped into the room and pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket. "I've been keeping records. Every person you've treated since you arrived. Every life you've saved. The miner with the crushed arm who Dr. Patterson wanted to amputate. The woman bleeding to death in childbirth. The children who survived scarlet fever." She handed Margaret the paper. 73 people. That's how many lives you've saved in 3 months. 73 people who would be dead if you hadn't been here. Margaret stared at the carefully written names, each one accompanied by a date and brief description. She recognized every case, remembered every face, every moment of desperate struggle to pull someone back from death's edge. "I thought you might need reminding," Sarah said quietly, "of why this matters, of what you're fighting for." Margaret pulled the girl into a fierce embrace. "Thank you for this, for everything, for being braver than I deserve." "You deserve everything," Sarah whispered. "Don't let him make you forget that." The walk to Harlan's house felt longer than it should have. Margaret's boots crunched through fresh snow, her breath misting in the cold evening air. Lights blazed in the windows of the big house on the hill, warm and welcoming in appearance, concealing whatever darkness waited inside. The same stern-faced housekeeper opened the door, her expression unreadable as she led Margaret through the familiar hallways. But this time, instead of the study, they went to the dining room, a formal space Margaret hadn't seen before, dominated by a long table set with fine china and crystal. Victor Harland stood at the head of the table, dressed in evening clothes that must have cost more than Caleb's entire inventory. But it was the woman seated at his right that made Margaret's steps falter. Victoria Harland, the mine owner's wife, whom Margaret had never met. She was younger than her husband by at least 20 years, beautiful in the fragile way of expensive porcelain, and very, very pregnant. "Mrs. Turner," Harland said smoothly, "thank you for joining us. You know my wife, I believe?" "We've never been introduced," Margaret said carefully. "An oversight I'm correcting now. Victoria, this is Margaret Turner, the woman we've been discussing." Victoria Harland studied Margaret with intelligent blue eyes that held no warmth. "The notorious healer. My husband speaks of you often." "I'm sure he does," Margaret said. "Please sit." Harland gestured to a chair across from his wife. "We'll dine first. Business can wait until after we've eaten." The meal that followed was surreal, course after course of rich food Margaret barely tasted, served by silent staff while Harland made pleasant conversation about the weather, the mines, the territorial politics in Helena. Victoria said little, but Margaret felt her gaze constantly, assessing, measuring. Finally, when the plates were cleared and coffee served, Harlan leaned back in his chair and studied Margaret with the same calculating expression she'd come to know. I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here. I imagine you're about to tell me. Direct. I appreciate that. Harlan sipped his coffee. The truth is, Margaret, may I call you Margaret? You've created quite a problem for me. You've saved lives, yes. Made yourself indispensable to this town. But in doing so, you've also shown my workers that they don't need to accept things as they are. That change is possible. That someone like you, an outsider, a woman, someone with no official authority, can accomplish more than all my money and power. Is that a problem? Margaret asked. It is when it makes them question my authority. When it makes them think they can demand better conditions, higher wages, safer practices. His voice hardened. When it makes them forget their place. Perhaps they've forgotten their place because their place isn't acceptable. Perhaps watching their children nearly die from an epidemic reminded them that life is worth more than coal and profit. Perhaps, Harlan set down his cup. But that kind of thinking is dangerous. It leads to unions, strikes, chaos. And I won't allow that in my town. It's not your town, Victor. It belongs to everyone who lives here. Does it? He smiled coldly. Then let me clarify something for you. I own the mines. I own the land most houses sit on. I own the freight company that brings in supplies. If I decide tomorrow to shut down operations, this entire town ceases to exist within a month. Everyone here depends on my continued goodwill, including you. If you have such power, why am I here? Why not simply destroy me as you've threatened? Because destruction is wasteful, and I'm a businessman above all else. Harlan leaned forward. I have a proposition, one I think you'll find more palatable than my previous offers. Margaret waited, her stomach knotting with dread. My wife is 7 months pregnant with our first child, Harlan continued. The pregnancy has been difficult. Dr. Patterson admits he's not equipped to handle potential complications. The nearest hospital is in Helena, too far away if something goes wrong during delivery. Margaret's eyes moved to Victoria, seeing the fear beneath her cool composure, the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped her coffee cup. I need someone I can trust to attend the birth, Harlan said. Someone with real skill, not just frontier competence. I need you, Margaret. And in exchange? In exchange, I stop investigating your past. I stop questioning your methods. I use my influence to legitimize your practice here, to ensure no one challenges your right to treat patients. He paused. I make you respectable, Margaret. I give you the protection of my name and position. You become the town's official healer, endorsed and supported by its most powerful citizen. It was everything Margaret should want: security, legitimacy, the ability to practice medicine without fear of prosecution or harassment, the chance to teach Sarah openly, to save more lives, to finally stop running. All she had to do was deliver Victor Harlan's child. And if something goes wrong during the delivery? Margaret asked quietly. If despite my best efforts the baby doesn't survive? Or your wife doesn't survive? Harlan's face went cold. Then our agreement is void, and I make certain you pay for your failure in ways you can't imagine. So if I succeed, I'm rewarded. If I fail, even through no fault of my own, I'm destroyed. Margaret's laugh was bitter. That's not an agreement, Victor. That's a hostage situation. Call it what you like, but it's the best offer you're going to get. Margaret looked at Victoria Harlan, at this young woman who'd been used as a pawn in her husband's game. Does your wife have any say in this? Or is she just another piece of property you're negotiating over? Victoria's eyes flashed with anger, the first real emotion Margaret had seen from her. Don't presume to speak for me, Mrs. Turner. I may be younger than my husband, but I'm not a fool. I know exactly what kind of arrangement this is. Then you know how dangerous it is for both of us. I know my baby deserves the best chance at life. And despite what you think of my husband, he's right about one thing. You're the most skilled healer in this territory. I've heard the stories, the children you saved, the impossible cases. If anyone can bring my baby safely into this world, it's you. Victoria's voice softened slightly. Please, Mrs. Turner, I'm asking as a mother who wants to hold her child, not as leverage in my husband's schemes. Margaret felt the trap closing from all sides. If she refused, Harland would destroy her, and she believed him capable of it now. But if she agreed and anything went wrong, the result would be the same. Her only path to survival was to succeed perfectly, to deliver a healthy baby and keep the mother alive, to perform under impossible pressure with her entire future hanging in the balance. "I need to think about this," Margaret said. "You have until tomorrow morning," Harland replied. "After that, the offer expires and we proceed with more permanent solutions to the problem you represent." Margaret stood, her legs unsteady. "I'll give you my answer then." She walked home through streets lit by gas lamps and stars, her mind churning through impossible options. The weight of Sarah's list felt heavy in her pocket. 73 lives saved, each one a testament to her skill and dedication. But what good was that record if she couldn't survive to save more? Caleb was waiting on the steps when she arrived, Thomas asleep against his shoulder. He took one look at her face and understood. "That bad?" "Worse." Margaret sank down beside them, exhausted beyond measure. "He wants me to deliver his wife's baby. If I succeed, he legitimizes my practice. If I fail, he destroys me. That's blackmail. That's Victor Harland." Margaret rested her head against Caleb's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I don't know what to do. Every choice leads to disaster." "Then maybe you're looking at it wrong," Caleb said quietly. "Maybe the choice isn't about success or failure. Maybe it's about who you are and what you stand for." "What do you mean?" "You became a healer to save lives, not to play political games, not to win battles against men like Harland, just to save lives." He shifted Thomas to a more comfortable position. "So the question isn't whether to accept his deal. The question is whether you can stand by and let a woman and child die just because her husband's a bastard." Margaret closed her eyes, knowing he was right. Knowing that despite everything, despite the threats, the manipulation, the impossible terms, she couldn't refuse to help someone who needed her skills. It wasn't in her nature. It had never been in her nature, which was exactly why she'd been run out of Boston in the first place. "I hate that you're right," she murmured. "I know, but that's what makes you who you are." Caleb kissed the top of her head. The woman who saves lives even when it costs her everything. The next morning, Margaret sent word to Harland accepting his terms. But she added one condition of her own. She wanted everything in writing, signed by witnesses, legally binding. If she succeeded, Harland would uphold his end of the bargain. And if she failed through no negligence of her own, she would be held harmless. Harland agreed, probably amused by her attempt at protection. Legal documents meant nothing when you owned the lawyers and judges. But it made Margaret feel slightly less powerless, and perhaps that was worth something. She spent the next 2 months preparing. She examined Victoria weekly, monitoring the baby's position, the mother's health, looking for any sign of complications. She gathered supplies and made contingency plans for every potential crisis she could imagine, and she taught Sarah everything she knew about childbirth, the normal process, and all the ways it could go terribly wrong. "Why are you teaching me this?" Sarah asked one evening as they reviewed procedures. "You'll be the one delivering the baby." "Because nothing's certain," Margaret said. "And if something happens to me, someone needs to carry this knowledge forward. Someone needs to remember that women can do this, that we don't have to accept the limitations men place on us." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You're talking like you're not coming back." "I'm talking like someone who's learned to plan for the worst." Margaret pulled the girl close. "But I'm fighting like someone who plans to win. Don't forget that." The contractions started on a cold February night, 2 weeks before Victoria's due date. The housekeeper arrived at the store in a panic, and Margaret grabbed her prepared bag and followed her through the snowy streets. She found Victoria in her bedroom, gripping the bedposts as another contraction racked her body. Harland paced nearby, his face gray with fear, poorly concealed beneath his usual cold control. "How long between contractions?" Margaret asked, already examining Victoria. "About 10 minutes, Victoria gasped. "They started this afternoon, but weren't bad until an hour ago." Margaret's examination confirmed her fears. The baby was breech, feet first instead of head down. She'd hoped it would turn naturally, but that hadn't happened. Now they faced the most dangerous kind of delivery, one that killed mothers and babies with frightening regularity. I need to turn the baby, Margaret said quietly. It's risky, but less risky than a breech birth. Do whatever you need to do, Harlan said immediately. I was talking to your wife, Margaret snapped. Victoria, this is going to be painful, and there's a chance it won't work. But if we don't try, the alternative is much worse. Victoria met her eyes, and in that moment, Margaret saw the steel beneath the porcelain beauty. Do it. What followed was hours of desperate work. Margaret's hands pressed against Victoria's swollen belly, trying to coax the baby into turning. Victoria screamed through gritted teeth, sweat pouring down her face. Harlan stood in the corner, white-knuckled and silent, watching the woman he'd used as leverage suffer for her child. Finally, near midnight, Margaret felt the baby shift, turn, settle into the correct position. It worked, she breathed, the baby's head down now. But the relief was short-lived. Victoria's labor intensified, the contractions coming hard and fast. And as the hours stretched toward dawn, it became clear that something was wrong. The baby wasn't descending properly. The labor was stalling. Margaret examined Victoria again and felt her heart sink. The baby's shoulder was caught on the pelvic bone, another complication that could prove fatal if not resolved quickly. I need you to push when I tell you, Margaret said. Not before. And Victoria, she gripped the younger woman's hand. This is going to hurt more than anything you've ever felt, but you have to trust me. Can you do that? Yes, Victoria whispered. Margaret worked with steady hands and fierce concentration, manipulating the baby's position during contractions, guiding, coaxing, refusing to give up even as exhaustion clawed at her. She'd delivered countless babies in her years of practice, but this one carried the weight of her entire future. If she failed, Harlan would destroy her. If she succeeded, she'd finally have the security she'd been running toward for 15 years. But as she worked, as she fought to bring this child safely into the world, Margaret realized that wasn't what drove her. It wasn't fear of Harlan or hope of reward. It was the same thing that had always driven her, the inability to stand by while someone died if she had the skill to save them. This was who she was. This was who she'd always been, from the first time she'd watched William Ashford save a life and known with absolute certainty what her own life's purpose must be. Now, Victoria, she said. Push now. Victoria bore down with a scream of effort and agony. Margaret felt the baby's shoulder slip free, felt the small body finally moving, descending. Again, one more. Another push, and suddenly the baby slipped into Margaret's waiting hands, a tiny, perfect girl, purple and angry and blessedly alive. The baby drew breath and screamed. Margaret had never heard a more beautiful sound. She quickly cleaned the infant and placed her on Victoria's chest while she delivered the afterbirth and checked for bleeding. Everything was proceeding normally. Mother and baby were both alive, both healthy. They'd made it. Margaret stepped back, her hands shaking with exhaustion and relief. She looked up to find Harlan staring at her, his face transformed by an emotion she'd never seen there before. Gratitude mixed with something like awe. You did it, he said hoarsely. You saved them both. I did my job, Margaret replied. Nothing more. But Harlan shook his head. No. You performed a miracle. I watched you, the way you worked, the way you knew exactly what to do. Patterson couldn't have done that. No one else could have done that. He moved closer, his voice dropping. I misjudged you, Margaret Turner. I thought you were just an aging fraud, using desperate people to feel important. But you're the genuine article, aren't you? A real healer. Perhaps the finest this territory has ever seen. Margaret was too tired to feel triumph. She simply nodded. Our agreement stands, Harlan continued. I'll uphold my end. You have my word. Your word, Margaret repeated. Forgive me if I trust the written contract more. To her surprise, Harlan laughed. A genuine sound, not his usual cold amusement. Fair enough. You'll have everything I promised. The legitimacy, the protection, the respect. He paused. And an apology. For trying to control you, to use you as a weapon against your own principles. That was beneath me. Was it? Margaret's voice was hard. Or was it exactly what you've always done? Used people as tools to maintain your power? Harlan's expression sobered. Perhaps both. But watching you tonight, seeing what real skill and dedication look like. I'm reminded that some things can't be owned or controlled. Some things simply are, and trying to force them into cages only diminishes them. He looked at his wife and daughter. Thank you, Margaret. Truly. Margaret left the Harland house as dawn was breaking, walking through streets painted pink and gold by the rising sun. She felt hollowed out, wrung dry of everything except the bone-deep satisfaction of a job well done. Caleb was waiting on the steps again, Sarah beside him. They stood when they saw her approaching, their faces anxious. It's done, Margaret said. Mother and baby both healthy. A girl. Sarah's whoop of joy echoed down the street. She threw her arms around Margaret, squeezing tight enough to hurt. I knew you could do it. I knew it. Did you? Margaret laughed shakily. Because I wasn't sure myself. Yes, you were, Caleb said quietly. You always are when it matters. That's your gift. They went inside to find Thomas had cooked breakfast, slightly burned bacon and toast, but made with love. The family sat together at the small table, and Margaret felt something shift inside her. This was home, not just a place to hide, not just a refuge from the past, but actually home. These people were her family, not through blood, but through choice and struggle, and the 1,000 small moments of caring that built true connection. The news of Victoria Harland's successful delivery spread through town like wildfire. Within days, Margaret's practice exploded. Women who'd been too afraid or too proud to seek her help before now came openly, asking for advice on pregnancies, on children's illnesses, on everything from minor complaints to serious conditions. Dr. Patterson, instead of feeling threatened, seemed relieved to share the burden. I'm too old for this, he admitted one afternoon as they worked together treating a young boy's broken arm. Been feeling it for years, but I couldn't retire. Who would care for these people? Now, though, he smiled. Now I know they'll be in good hands. True to his word, Victor Harland used his influence to legitimize Margaret's practice. He arranged for her to be officially recognized as a medical practitioner by the territorial authorities, bypassing the usual restrictions that prevented women from holding such positions. He made it clear to the town that anyone who questioned Margaret's authority would answer to him. It was strange being under Harland's protection instead of his threat, but Margaret accepted it pragmatically. She'd use his power to do good, to save lives, to teach other women like Sarah who deserved better than the limitations the world tried to impose on them. And Sarah blossomed under Margaret's teaching. The girl had natural talent that went beyond mere intelligence. She had the instinct for healing, the ability to stay calm in crisis, the compassion necessary to treat the suffering with dignity. Margaret began taking her on house calls, letting her assist with more complex procedures, preparing her for a future that seemed impossible, but that Margaret was determined to make real. Do you really think I could become a doctor? Sarah asked one evening as they walked home from treating a difficult case. I think you could become anything you set your mind to, Margaret replied. The world will try to stop you. Men will tell you it's impossible, that women aren't suited for medicine, that you should accept your proper place. But Sarah, she stopped walking and gripped the girl's shoulders. Those same men told me I couldn't do what I do. They tried to cage me, to silence me, to make me small. And here I am, still standing, still saving lives. So yes, I believe you can become a doctor, if you're willing to fight for it the way I've had to fight. Sarah's eyes shone with determination. I'll fight, whatever it takes. Good. Because the world needs healers like you. Women who refuse to accept that half the population should be barred from using their gifts to their fullest. They walked on in comfortable silence, and Margaret felt the weight she'd carried for so many years beginning to lift. She'd found more than a refuge in Black Hollow Ridge. She'd found a purpose beyond simple survival. She'd found a way to take the pain and loss of her past and transform it into something good. Spring came to the mountains, melting the snow and bringing new life to the harsh landscape. Margaret stood in the small yard behind the store, planting the herbs she'd use for medicine, feeling the sun warm on her face. There's someone here to see you, Caleb called from the doorway. Margaret turned to find a woman she didn't recognize standing nervously in the store. She was perhaps 40, travel-worn and dusty, with the look of someone who'd come a long distance. Mrs. Turner? The woman asked. Margaret Ashford Turner? Margaret felt her stomach clench at the use of her full name. Yes, how can I help you? My name is Elizabeth Warren. I've come from Boston. The woman's voice trembled. I'm William Ashford's niece. I've been searching for you for years. The world seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. William Ashford's niece. She'd known he had family, but she'd never met them, never expected. Why? Margaret asked. Why search for me? Because my uncle spoke of you constantly in the months before he died. He said you were the finest surgical assistant he'd ever trained. He said losing you broke his heart more surely than any physical ailment. Elizabeth reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. Before he died, he wrote this. He made me promise I'd find you, give it to you, make sure you knew the truth. Margaret took the envelope with shaking hands. Her name was written on the front in William's familiar script. He never blamed you, Elizabeth continued, for what happened with the senator's son. He was proud of you for saving that boy's life. He said the medical establishment destroyed you because they feared what you represented, a woman who was better than most men, who proved their arguments about female inferiority to be lies. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face. He died defending your reputation, Margaret, died trying to clear your name. And he wanted you to know that nothing you did was shameful, that you should never have had to run, never have had to hide. Margaret's vision blurred with tears as she opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. William's words, written in those final months, filled page after page. He wrote about his pride in her accomplishments, his fury at the injustice done to her, his hope that she'd found peace somewhere, and at the end, a plea. Don't let them make you small, Margaret. Don't let fear or shame or the cruelty of small-minded men stop you from being who you were meant to be. The world needs healers like you. Women need to see what's possible. Promise me you'll keep fighting. Promise me you'll never stop being extraordinary. Margaret read the words through tears, feeling the weight of 15 years of grief and guilt beginning to lift. William hadn't blamed her. He'd been proud of her. He'd died defending her. There's more, Elizabeth said gently. The medical board in Boston has reconsidered your case. With new testimony and William's documentation of your training, they've agreed to issue you a formal certificate of competence. It's not a medical degree. They still won't grant those to women. But it's official recognition of your skills and training. You can practice openly now without fear of prosecution. Margaret stared at her. Why would they do that? Because William left his entire estate to funding women's medical education, and part of the endowment was contingent on them clearing your name and issuing that certificate. Elizabeth smiled. He fought for you even after death, Margaret. He made sure you'd be free. The certificate Elizabeth handed her was beautifully printed, bearing official seals and signatures. It stated that Margaret Ashford had received advanced medical training under Dr. William Ashford, had demonstrated exceptional skill in surgery and emergency medicine, and was hereby recognized as a qualified medical practitioner. It was everything Margaret had never dared hope for. Legitimacy without compromise, recognition without submission, freedom to practice without fear. I don't know what to say, Margaret whispered. Say you'll keep his legacy alive. Say you'll keep fighting, keep teaching, keep proving that women belong in medicine. Elizabeth gripped her hands. Say you'll help me establish a medical school for women using William's endowment, because that's the other reason I came. We're building something real, Margaret. A place where women can train openly, where they can become the doctors they were meant to be. And I want you to be part of it. I want you to teach the next generation what William taught you. Margaret looked around at the life she'd built in Black Hollow Ridge. The store, the family, the practice she'd established. The town that had learned to trust her, to value her. Sarah, who looked up to her with such hope and determination. I can't leave, she said finally. This is my home now. These are my people. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to expand. Elizabeth's eyes lit with passion. Teach here. Train students here. Make this place a center for frontier medicine. Show the world that healing happens wherever there are healers willing to do the work. She paused. William always said the best medicine happened not in fancy hospitals, but in the places where people really needed it. What better place than here? Margaret felt something vast and beautiful opening up before her. Not a choice between past and future, between Boston and Black Hollow Ridge, but a way to honor both. A way to take everything she'd learned through struggle and loss and transform it into something that would outlast her. I'll need time to think about it, she said, to discuss it with my family. This affects all of us. Of course, I'll be staying at the boarding house for a few days. Come find me when you're ready to talk details. After Elizabeth left, Margaret stood holding William's letter and the certificate, feeling the weight of possibilities settling over her shoulders. Caleb came to stand beside her, reading the documents over her shoulder. This is it, he said quietly. Everything you've been running toward. Everything you've deserved all along. It's more than I expected, more than I dreamed possible. So what will you do? Margaret looked out at the town spread below the hillside, at the mountains rising beyond, at the harsh, beautiful country that had become home. She thought of the children she'd saved, the women she'd helped, the lives she'd touched in the months since arriving as an unwanted bride. Nobody expected to matter. She thought of Sarah, brilliant and fierce and hungry for knowledge, of the other women in this town and towns beyond who deserved the chance to learn, to heal, to be more than what the world told them they could be. I'm going to say yes, Margaret said. I'm going to help build that school. I'm going to train women in real medicine, give them the tools and knowledge they need to save lives. And I'm going to do it right here, in this place that took a chance on a 53-year-old mail-order bride who was supposed to be too old, too broken, too unwanted to matter. Caleb pulled her close, and Margaret leaned into his embrace, feeling the rightness of it all. The journey from Boston to Black Hollow Ridge, from shame to vindication, from hiding to standing openly in her power, it had all led to this moment. I'm proud of you, Caleb murmured into her hair. Prouder than I can say. I didn't do it alone. You gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. You defended me when the whole town wanted me gone. You believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. I just saw what was already there. The rest was all you. They stood together as the sun set over Black Hollow Ridge, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. And Margaret felt for the first time in 15 years the sweet certainty of being exactly where she was meant to be. The school took shape over the following months. Margaret converted a building near the church into a teaching hospital where women could learn medicine through direct practice. Elizabeth arranged funding through William's endowment. Students began arriving, young women from across the territory who'd heard about the place where women could train as real healers. Sarah was the first student to enroll, of course, followed by Emma Reeves, who discovered a passion for healing while caring for her baby. Then 3 more women from neighboring towns, drawn by word of what was happening in Black Hollow Ridge. Dr. Patterson became an instructor, sharing his decades of knowledge with students who actually wanted to learn. Victor Harland, true to his word, provided funding and support, perhaps in genuine gratitude, or perhaps simply because he recognized good business when he saw it. Either way, his backing gave the school legitimacy it couldn't have achieved otherwise. And Margaret taught. She taught with the same fierce dedication William Ashford had brought to her training, refusing to accept anything less than excellence from her students, while also showing them that excellence was within their reach. She taught them surgery and emergency medicine, pharmacology, and diagnosis. She taught them to trust their skills, to question authority when it deserved questioning, to never accept limitations imposed by men who feared female competence. Some people in town still disapproved. Mrs. Greenlee maintained her tight-lipped disapproval of women stepping outside their proper sphere. Others worried about the precedent, about what it meant for the natural order when women started doing men's work. But those voices grew quieter as the school's graduates proved themselves. As women trained by Margaret saved lives throughout the territory, delivered babies safely, treated illnesses with real knowledge instead of folk remedies and prayer. Results spoke louder than prejudice. 2 years after that first scarlet fever outbreak, Margaret stood in the teaching hospital and watched Sarah perform her first solo surgery, a complicated appendectomy on a minor who would have died without immediate intervention. The girl's hands were steady, her judgment sound, her technique flawless. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as Sarah successfully completed the procedure and the patient's vitals remained stable. This was what William had meant. This was the legacy he'd wanted her to build. Not just saving individual lives, but creating more healers who would go on to save countless others. After the surgery, Sarah found Margaret in her office, still crying. "What's wrong?" the girl asked in alarm. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right." Margaret pulled her into a fierce hug. "I'm just so proud of you, so proud of who you've become. I learned from the best, Sarah said softly. You showed me what was possible. You showed all of us. William Ashford showed me first. I'm just passing it on. Then that's what I'll do too. Teach others the way you taught me. Make sure his legacy, your legacy, keeps spreading. Sarah pulled back, her eyes bright. I've been accepted to the medical college in Philadelphia. They're starting to admit women, and they want graduates from your school. Margaret's heart swelled with pride and bittersweetness. Philadelphia, that's far. I know, but it's time, isn't it? Time for me to go out into the world and fight my own battles, the way you fought yours. You're braver than I ever was at your age. No, I'm just following the path you cleared. Sarah gripped Margaret's hands. Thank you for taking a chance on an angry, grieving girl who thought she had to do everything alone, for showing me there was another way. Margaret hugged her again, knowing this was right, knowing she had to let Sarah go even though it hurt. This was what success looked like. Students who surpassed their teachers, who took the knowledge and made it their own, who went out into the world to create change. The day Sarah left for Philadelphia, the whole town gathered to see her off. She stood on the train platform in her traveling clothes, clutching the bag packed with medical texts and equipment, her face bright with determination and excitement. Write to me, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. Tell me everything you learn, everyone you save. I want to hear all of it. I will, and Margaret, Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. When I become a real doctor, when I have my degree and my license and everything they said women couldn't have, it'll be because you showed me it was possible. Everything I accomplish, every life I save, it's because you didn't give up. Because you kept fighting even when the whole world told you to stop. Make it count then, Margaret said. Make all the struggle worth it. I will. I promise. The train whistle blew and Sarah climbed aboard. Margaret stood with Caleb and Thomas, waving until the train disappeared around the mountain curve. Then she walked back through the town she'd arrived in 3 years ago as an unwanted bride nobody expected to matter. The town that had become home. The place where she'd finally stopped running and started building something that would outlast her own life. She passed the church where she'd set up the first makeshift hospital during the mine collapse. The store where Caleb had taken a chance on a strange older woman with silver hair and secrets in her eyes. The school where women were learning to heal, to save lives, to be more than the world told them they could be. And Margaret realized that this, all of this, was what William had meant when he told her not to let them make her small, not to stop being extraordinary. She'd been running for 15 years, trying to escape the scandal in Boston, the shame of being judged and found wanting. But she hadn't needed to escape. She'd needed to find a place where her gifts mattered more than her gender, where skill counted more than propriety, where a 53-year-old woman could arrive as nobody special and become essential. That evening, Margaret stood in the small yard behind the store, harvesting herbs in the golden light of sunset. Caleb came to stand beside her, and they worked together in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes after years of genuine partnership. Do you ever regret it? He asked finally. Answering my advertisement, coming to this remote corner of nowhere? Margaret straightened, her hands full of lavender, and looked at the man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. The husband who'd become a true partner, the family who'd become home. Not for a single moment, she said. This is where I was meant to be, where we were all meant to be. Even though it's been hard, even though you've had to fight every step of the way. Especially because of that. The easy path would have been accepting Harlan's first offer, letting him control me, making myself small to fit his idea of acceptable. But the hard path, the one where I stood my ground and fought for what was right, that's the one that mattered. That's the one that changed things. Caleb pulled her close, mindful of the herbs she held. You changed more than things, Margaret. You changed lives. You changed this whole town. You showed us what strength really looks like. Margaret leaned against him, feeling the weight of those words settle around her shoulders like a mantle. Not the burden of expectation, but the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. She'd arrived in Black Hollow Ridge as Margaret Hale, a woman running from her past, expecting nothing but survival. She'd become Margaret Turner, wife and mother, accepted but never quite belonging. And finally, she'd embraced being Margaret Ashford Turner, healer, teacher, woman who refused to be diminished by a world determined to make her small. The journey had cost her everything at times, but it had also given her everything that mattered. A home, a family, a purpose, and most importantly, the freedom to use her gifts without shame or apology. In the years that followed, Margaret's school grew into one of the finest medical training institutions in the Western Territories. Her students spread across the frontier, bringing real medical knowledge to places that desperately needed it. Dr. Sarah Turner graduated from Philadelphia Medical College at the top of her class and returned to Black Hollow Ridge to teach alongside the woman who'd shown her what was possible. And Margaret herself continued healing until age finally slowed her hands. She worked into her 70s teaching and treating, proving every day that a woman dismissed as too old, too unwanted, too improper could accomplish extraordinary things if given the chance. When she finally died at the age of 78, surrounded by family and former students, the entire territory mourned. The church couldn't hold everyone who came to pay respects. Minors whose lives she'd saved, women she'd taught, children she'd delivered who'd grown into adults with children of their own. They buried her in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Black Hollow Ridge, next to Caleb, who'd passed 2 years earlier. And on her headstone, they carved not the traditional words of feminine virtue, but a simple truth that captured who she'd been, Margaret Ashford. Turner healer, teacher, pioneer. She saved lives. When they said it was impossible. And in the school she'd founded, in the students she'd trained, in the lives saved by women who followed the path she'd cleared, in all of that, Margaret's legacy continued to grow and spread, proving with each passing year that the woman no one wanted had been exactly who the world needed. The bride who arrived too old, too plain, too unwanted, had saved not just individual lives, but had helped reshape what women could be and do in a world still learning to see their worth. And that, far more than youth or beauty or conventional success, was a legacy worth every hard-won moment of the journey.